It would seem that contacts with the diplomacy of a great cultural and scientific power should have expanded general cooperation in these areas so beneficial for the friendship of peoples. Alas, the conversations of Krestinsky, Brodowski, Besenov and, to a lesser extent, Kinchak were sadly similar to one another. The Berliner Tageblatt wrote, the Frankfurter Zeitung, by the way, a newspaper whose correspondent was Richard Sorge and which was closely connected with the Jewish capital of Germany, slandered, Angriff and Volkischer Beobachter were distorted, and in Munich someone was arrested for 6 hours. Well, anything happened in Berlin. Even Americans after 1933 were arrested and sometimes assaulted, but they did not interfere in the internal affairs of Germany, encouraging the work of the Communist Party, unlike our employees. The American ambassadors treated this philosophically, that is, they protested, but in general they did not care. Litvinov and his kid immediately made a mountain out of a mountain, if not an elephant, then a completely discordant black cat. And now Krestinsky, in response to a fair reproach addressed to Izvestia, in response to Schubert's business proposal, began to be indignant at the behavior of the German press and the German government, which allegedly does not stop the harassment against us. I believe that if articles appear in our press that are unpleasant for the German government, then it is not our press that starts, and our press publishes much fewer articles of this kind. But Mr. Krestinsky, most of our newspapers are independent of the government, and you not only do not deny your control over the entire Soviet press, but even proclaim it as a fundamental principle. We have many enemies of German-Soviet friendship, and they have plenty of newspapers in their hands. But even the Kölnische Zeitung, which is close to Ausamt, is not our organ, unlike Izvestia, which has the highest official status. Krestinsky refused to admit our guilt in anything and for anything once and for all, and therefore he simply began to teach Schubert how the German police should have behaved with the representative of our trade mission, who had made a small formal omission and was almost out of control floors that offered explosives to German companies. Mr. Krestinsky, the police really showed nervousness, and this is the result of your inciting the German communists. You provoke our workers to conclude agreements on competition, and they accept anti-government obligations. You honor Max goals. Schubert shook his head and continued, under these conditions it is extremely difficult for the Awesome to fight against sentiments against you in various social circles. How can I try, Schubert emphasized this word, to influence them if I myself am not sure of your loyalty? I apologize for being harsh, but I would like to have a frank conversation on all issues of our relationship in order to clear the political atmosphere and create an opportunity for far-reaching economic conversations. Both myself and Minister Sergius are friends of the German-Soviet work, and we would like to begin it in earnest in the near future. Schubert was sincere. His connections with industry, in particular with the stomach concern, were close, and this alone ensured his interest in us. And the words about German-Soviet work in the mouth of the German Secretary of State rang like pure gold. Alas, I don't know, reader, whether Krestinsky was grinning to himself, but his goal was not to clear the political atmosphere but, on the contrary, to pollute it to the extent possible so as not to get a slap on the cap for a noticeable disruption of economic ties. In any case, his answer was not just false but generally close to mockery. He did not pick up the economic theme, did not avoid slippery and unseemly moments, but began to be hypocritical. You, Mr. Schubert, are mixing up our government bodies and the Comintern. The Comintern is an organization that is not subordinate to our government and is not under its control. We are not responsible for any actions of the Comintern, and we do not want and cannot accept any obligations for it. Schubert did not know the Russian language, and even if he did, diplomatic politeness would not have allowed him to comment on Krestinsky's speeches with the appropriate Russian proverb, I am not I, and the horse is not mine, and I am not the cabman. And looking at the plenipotentiary's beard, one could add, Minin's beard, but his conscience is made of clay. In those same days, another huge scandal broke out in Paris. White emigrant Herzfeld filed a claim against the Soviet board of the Dobroflot Society for 2 million francs. Reason: in December 1920, he entered into an agreement with the White Guard board of Dobroflot, which had long since sunk to the political bottom. However, the dead do indeed capture the living. In May 1925, the British Supreme Court had already awarded Herzfeld £10,000 in his claim, and now he was seeking the same in France. And I achieved it. Litvinov, with his Anglo-Francophilism, got into a puddle and even confessed to the People's Commissar of Trade Anastas Mikoyan in a letter dated March 7, 1930. Recently we have to conclude that in France we are actually outlawed, and on July 24, the USSR chargé d'affaires in France, Reich, panicked. Herzfeld can begin inventorying and selling our property. We must either pay Herzfeld 2 million or be prepared for the public sale of our property, including the furniture of the trade mission. That's it, reader. In France, they were preparing to auction off not ambassadorial stools but the foreign policy prestige of the Soviet Union, our honor and dignity. But here the Litvinovites were unusually restrained and paid attention to the frantic persecution of the French and British press insofar as they were satisfied with the French's references to freedom of the press. And France did not even have nearly the same economic importance for us as Germany. Krestinsky's conversation with von Schubert was typical of the established Litvinov style in relations with Germany. On March 5, 1930, at the apartment of the German Foreign Minister Curtius, Krestinsky and Brodowski talked with Curtius and Schubert for 2 hours. Curtius had just recovered from his illness but was cheerful and energetic. Gentlemen, the government and I are committed to maintaining, developing and deepening our friendly relations. I think we must first get rid of all the accumulated conflicts by meeting each other halfway. I propose today not to talk about claims but to outline the next plan. Krestinsky winced slightly, wanting to show that specific claims are more important than any plans, but he restrained himself, and Curtius continued, I imagine it like this. In the next month Dirksen and Litvinov are in Moscow, and here you, Mr. Krestinsky, and Schubert will sort out and get rid of old conflicts. I'll rest during this time. Then we meet and discuss issues of our policy from the angle of common objectives in a number of foreign policy and economic areas. At the third stage of conversations, we move on to practical issues in the field of joint economic work and economic activities, loans and so on. So how did Krestinsky react to this? That's how. I have no objection to the plan, Mr. Minister, but I consider it unacceptable if during our introductory conversation today we do not touch upon misunderstandings and conflicts at all. I would like to at least list our complaints so that you have an idea of their size and depth. And Krestinsky took the thick folder from Brodowski's hands. Recently, Schubert showed the plenipotentiary also a thin German folder, but only showed it, and Krestinsky, with visible pleasure, handed it to Curtius and began his speeches. Curtius listened, then spoke very peacefully about the Comintern and the intervention of the KSU in German affairs. Krestinsky pretended to be Admiral Nelson, looking at an unpleasant question through a telescope attached to his blind eye. Litvinov was also fond of the same Nelsonism in Moscow. On March 17, he writes a letter of instruction to Krestinsky. Your conversations with Curtius must be considered completely inconclusive. What should we seek from the German government? The German press began anti-Soviet persecution, but the government responded by citing the independence of the press. German political and industrial figures are making proposals for a severance of relations and even for German participation in the intervention. The government responds that it is not responsible for the speech of private individuals. but we can demand from the German government that it itself publicly take a position. At that time, reader, in France, England and the USA, not only private individuals but broad parliamentary and government circles, the most influential newspapers called for a crusade against the USSR. Hostile anti-Soviet provocations in the London Parliament became a daily occurrence. In 1930, the United States introduced discriminatory conditions for Soviet exports. France introduced restrictions on the import of Soviet goods. Litvinov did not have to demand that the governments of these countries publicly define their position. It was quite definite. Anti-Soviet. But the new People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the USSR assessed Sergius's friendly plan as follows. Sergius refuses to lift a finger. And in his most amazing letter, Litvinov simply egged on the Berlin plenipotentiary. At one of the most critical, in the opinion of Litvinov but not Sergius, S.K. moments of Soviet-German relations when the German press, party, S.K. and industrial circles have given sufficient reason to the whole world to count Germany among the most hostile, S.K. to the Union of States. The German government avoids answering our question about its attitude to this assessment of the role of Germany. You should conduct further conversations with Schubert and the Außenamt officials, making it absolutely clear that the Sergius plan does not satisfy us at all and has even caused us extreme dissatisfaction. Litvinov reported so much that he wrote about party circles, although there were about a dozen significant parties in Germany at that time, and among them was the Communist Party. But the point was not this slip of the tongue, but the orientation towards a hostile, irreconcilable tone with the Germans. Litvinov had not yet become People's Commissar, but was already creating the image of Germany as an enemy in those very days when the newly appointed trade representative of the USSR, Lyubimov, declared to representatives of the German press, "My appointment coincides with a period of rapid development of the Soviet economy. The 5-year plan, the economic and social content of which is probably known to the German public, is connected with the expansion of our foreign trade. The wider the process of reconstruction and technical re-equipment of our industry goes, the greater the need to purchase machines, precision instruments, apparatus and technical materials increases. Germany, hostile, according to Litvinov, S.K. ranks first in Soviet exports. This importance of Germany is explained by the fact that it knows the USSR relatively well, has managed to show interest in strengthening ties with our external bodies and has accumulated experience in working together. This is also explained by the friendly relations existing between the Soviet Union and Germany, which was one of the first countries to establish broad economic relations with us. The presence of a trade agreement with Germany, which we did not have with the British, French and the States, S.K. creates the possibility of normal development of business relations. Along with the prospects for the development of Soviet-German trade turnover, the 5-year plan opens up greater opportunities for the use of German technology in the most diverse areas of our economy. The role of foreign technology in our economy is increasing every year, and here wide opportunities are opening up for German technical forces. What can be added to this by comparing Litvinov's writings and Lyubimov's words? Perhaps nothing. No, I can't resist, and I'll introduce you, dear reader, to these lines of a letter from the head of the 2nd Western Department of the NKVD of the USSR, Stein, dated March 17, 1930, to the same Krestinsky. Dear Nikolai Nikolaevich, today M. Litvinov S.K. writes to you regarding the general line of behavior towards the German government. On my own behalf, I can add that, under the cover of future negotiations on basic political and economic issues, the German government wants to get real concessions from us on a number of relatively unimportant ones. Well, they would have given in if they were not important to us. S.K. but still significant controversial issues for him. The fact is that there is a big difference between our and the German claims to each other. While we have only complaints against the German government has certain real claims against us. And perhaps nothing needs to be added to this. And on May 16, Litvinov arrogantly and pettily reprimanded von Dirksen in Moscow for the non-existent guilt of the German government. And then he began to act according to the old scheme of Sergei Yulievich Witt, who divorced Russia and Germany at the end of the last century. Of all the German claims, the most serious here, Litvinov was afraid that he had admitted something after all, and corrected himself not in its validity, but in its internal content, is the complaint about the decline in German exports to the USSR. This same complaint is countered by an equally serious complaint on our part regarding our exports to Germany. Yes, Russia and Germany have already gone through this. The customs wars provoked by Witt then greatly contributed to the reorientation of Tsarist Russia towards France. But now these were different times. Only Germany was ready to give Soviet Russia equipment in any quantities. Nevertheless, Litvinov proposed to study the reasons for this phenomenon. And the reasons were precisely the exceptionally large volumes of trade. Having started to muddy the waters here, it was possible to throw out the child with it, and Dirksen was unpleasantly surprised by Litvinov's proposal. Mr. Litvinov, I hope that the Conciliation Commission proposed by Minister Sergius and his parallel speech in the Reichstag, on which you so insist, can provide the calm you desire. But we would also like to receive an answer to our questions about your influence on the German communists. Minister Sergius touched on this topic in a conversation with Krestinsky. Your interference in our internal affairs, of course, complicates matters. I protest. Litvinov immediately jumped up. We didn't allow ourselves any interference, we didn't cause any bullying, and therefore this bullying requires justification. Dirksen listened dejectedly. He knew that the harassment was justified, and we, the reader, knowing about Chikarin's note, know the same as Dirksen. Soviet People's Commissars and German ambassadors did not always talk in such a manner. Just 3 years ago, when Georgy Vassilievich Chikarin was in power and truly led the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs of the USSR, his conversations with Brockdorff and Zau were simply an example of how a proletarian diplomat and a bourgeois diplomat could calmly cooperate in the interests of their countries without compromising them but respecting each other. In just 1 week at the end of November 1927, Chikarin and Randzow met twice on November 20 and 25. The trustworthiness of these conversations is simply amazing. On November 20, Randzow began by giving Georgy Vassilievich the German text of Streseman's encryption. Fortunately, Chikarin did not need a translator. It was truly a dialogue between like-minded people, not on political and ideological, but on state convictions. Both were sincerely convinced that the state and nationally justified policy of the two countries could be one: friendship and broad cooperation. They discussed subtle problems, they pointed out conflict areas to each other, but not in order to offend, but in order to eliminate them. This was an approach directly opposite to Litvinov's. And what about Litvinov? After all, in 1927 he was the second figure in the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs and also often met with the Germans. Oh, the tone of his speeches at that time proved well. Under Chikarin and Litvinov he had to be polite. I will quote, without adding a word, part of a personal transcript of his conversation on December 4, 1927 in Berlin with the German foreign minister of that time, Stresemann. I sat with Stresemann for over an hour, and our conversation was of a very relaxed and friendly nature. They talked a lot about personal topics, about the health of each of us, about resorts, vacations, etc. I half-jokingly told Stresemann that it was time for him to take a trip to the USSR. He began to ask about our resorts, but I said that they were not yet sufficiently equipped for foreign guests and suggested that it would be better for him to travel around the USSR, Crimea or the Caucasus for relaxation after treatment. Stresemann said that he could not even think about treatment, much less rest after it. I reminded him that recently authoritative Germans had come to us and studied the country for a long time, meaning the professor of the higher agricultural school in Berlin-Ohagen and the banker Melchior S.K. I recommended that Stresemann call such people to himself and get acquainted with their impressions if he does not have time to read the literature that we could deliver to him in foreign languages. That's how it is. Smart Germans did something similar. Only they summoned directly to them, to Germany, that Russian thing that was valuable for the German national character. Back in 1926, during Lunochharsky's visit to Berlin, the German State Secretary for Arts Edwin Redslaub asked for a meeting with our People's Commissar. 40-year-old Redslaub persuaded the Russian guest to introduce the Germans to Russian folk art as well as Russian icon painting. Redslaub was worried that German art was becoming more and more functional, more and more applied. How to furnish an apartment, what shape to give to a chair, how to revive a wall with color spots, etc. In Russians, Redslaub saw natural carriers of the sense of duty and wanted to demonstrate this to his compatriots. In February-May 1929, an exhibition of Russian icon painting of the 12th-18th centuries was held in Berlin, Cologne, Hamburg and Frankfurt am Main. The catalogue came out with a foreword by Lunochharsky and an article about old Russian painting by Igor Grabar. However, the era of Litvinov was coming. And now there are other speeches and other things to do. On June 16, 1930, under the chairmanship of Stamoniakov, the first session of the Soviet-German Conciliation Commission opened in Moscow. The first of two German delegate was Minister von Raumer, who prepared the Treaty of Rapallo. A joint Soviet-German communique appeared. Minister Sergius made the same political speech in the Reichstag that Litvinov had so insisted on, and confirmed Germany's commitment to the spirit and letter of the Treaty of Rapallo. But now, at 5 minutes, the official People's Commissar Litvinov no longer considered such a friendly statement from the Germans so important. On July 5, a skirmish arose between him and Dirksen again and again because of Litvinov's behavior. Dirksen came to Spiridonov worried. I fear for the progress of the work of the Conciliation Commission and for our prospects in general. You wanted us to make a political statement. Sergius made a speech in the Reichstag. The gift was made from the German side, but you did not reciprocate. And when the negative results of the negotiations become known in Germany, a new press campaign may begin. I don't know how to prevent this, so I came for advice. Litvinov did not adopt a confidential tone. Present. This word is inappropriate here, Mr. Ambassador. If we consider Rapallo a German gift, then we received it back in 1922. So you will declare that since the treaty was not denounced all these years, they gave us gifts almost every month, Mr. Ambassador. If there had not been anti-Soviet persecution in Germany, it would not have occurred to us to demand a new confirmation of Rapallo. Dirksen could argue that if there had been no activity of the Moscow Comintern in German society, then there would have been no bullying. But the Germans spoke on this topic less and less, realizing that the only thing they would get in response was the blatant, in-your-face hypocrisy of the Litvinovites and Litvinov personally. And Dirksen simply said, I was hoping for a different attitude to the questions raised. After family scenes and quarrels, love between spouses often strengthens, and it seemed to me that our relationship had only benefited from recent events. You, Mr. Litvinov, have obviously been informed that von Raumer has raised the issue of our loans to you. When quarrels arise due to inciting neighbors, they become chronic, and your press plays the role of such neighbors. And I only hear about loans, but where are they? Litvinov was cunning and dexterous, but did not have a great, broad mind, and he was busy with the wrong things. Therefore, he himself did not notice that with his answer to Dirksen he was exposing himself. Quarrels in families sometimes do happen because of someone's instigation, but because of malicious instigation, quarrels happen only in stupid families. And besides, Litvinov, in fact, admitted that it was precisely these instigations that he succumbed to. What can I say? Dirksen shrugged his shoulders and finally asked, It's strange. Sometimes you in the Conciliation Commission refuse to confirm even what you previously verbally agreed to. What's the matter? Litvinov, the reader, was born in a Jewish border town, and his answer well characterized both the People's Commissar's views on honor and morality and his business qualifications. Don't you, Mr. Dirksen, see the difference between an oral statement that I make after a private discussion with one or another people's commissar and an agreement binding the government. So, Litvinov, instead of giving even oral answers only after carefully elaborating the questions, initially engaged in irresponsible chatter with the Germans and then easily retracted his own words. Yes, the country received a worthy replacement for Chicherin, who was decent to the point of scrupulousness. We will have to dwell more than once on how this inexplicable change in the line of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs of the USSR can be explained, taking into account the fact that after Hitler came to power, new factors arose. But why did Litvinov so persistently not make efforts to ensure a normal situation in diplomatic affairs even with Weimar Germany? His personal sympathies were given to England for many reasons. France was also dear to his heart, but in diplomacy one is guided not by the heart but by the mind, by state calculations. And there was no calculation, at least state calculation, in Litvinov's behavior. We actively cooperated with Germany economically and increasingly moved away from it politically. Litvinov willingly succumbed to any encouragement instead of calmly separating the essential from the superficial and then working in order to mitigate these essential circumstances of intra-German life that were unfavorable for us. Litvinov could not help but know about the statement published in the English press in the early 1930s by Lord Balfour, chairman of the board of steel companies Arthur Balfour and Company Limited and Capital Steel Works, Sheffield, director of the National Provincial Bank. Will the Germans fight again? I firmly believe that one day we would either allow the Germans to arm themselves or we would arm them ourselves. In the face of a formidable threat from the east, an unarmed Germany would be like a ripe fruit just waiting for the Russians to pick it. If the Germans could not defend themselves, we would have to come to their defense. One of the greatest threats to the world is the complete disarmament of Germany. Figures like Balfour do not make such provocative statements out of the blue. Behind his words were the views and intentions of very influential circles. The desire to make the Russians and Germans enemies again was evident from every word. Our most effective foreign policy counteraction would not be the aggravation of conflict issues but the willingness to sacrifice secondary things for the sake of the main thing, mutual peace and broad trade with Germany. Litvinov, to the best of his ability, did the opposite. Looking ahead, I will say that Hitler's chancellorship was a gift of fate for Litvinov. Now he could wave the main work of the Führer Mein Kampf, my struggle, at all angles and poke everyone in the nose with chapters of Eastern orientation or Eastern policy. That same famous chapter that began like this. I consider it necessary to subject Germany's attitude towards Russia to a special analysis. This problem is of decisive importance for the entire foreign policy of Germany as a whole. The text of the chapter also contained 2 paragraphs, mainly due to which Hitler's book was known to wide layers of the Soviet public. We National Socialists quite deliberately put an end to all German foreign policy of the pre-war period. We want to return to the point where our old development was interrupted 600 years ago. We want to put a stop to the eternal German drive towards the south and west of Europe, and we definitely point the finger towards the territories located in the east. We are finally breaking with the colonial and trade policies of the pre-war era and are consciously moving towards a policy of conquering new lands in Europe. When we talk about the conquest of new lands in Europe, we, of course, can primarily mean only Russia and those peripheral states that are subordinate to it. But to understand the attitude of Hitler, and not yet a statesman of Germany, its Reich Chancellor, but a young aspiring politician, 2 paragraphs taken out of context are not enough. After all, most people know Mein Kampf only by its name, but not by its content. Actually, the content itself was foggy more than once. Doctor of Sciences of Suni in his 1975 book The Secret in which the war was born states that the second part of Mein Kampf, entirely devoted to foreign policy issues, became known only in 1961 after it was published in New York entitled Hitler's Secret Book. In the introductory article to the overseas edition, the very famous and very dubious American lawyer and General Telford Taylor claimed that Hitler dictated the text in the summer of 1928, and the manuscript was allegedly kept in the safe of the central publication of the NSDAP with strict instructions not to publish or show it to anyone. It was not clear, however, why Hitler dictated the text then, why such a secret text was not kept in his personal safe, and why such a sensation in America, which was greedy for them, lay without movement for a decade and a half, since 1945. Taylor profoundly reported, "Nowhere else did Hitler set out his foreign policy goals so openly and completely. In the book, Hitler justifies the policy of alliances in order to prepare for war. Here his thesis is fully revealed that Germany should look for living space in Russia, that France was and remains Germany's mortal enemy." Afsani did not dispute this nonsense, but later, apparently having forgotten himself, he wrote, "The aggressive intentions of the Nazis towards the Strangler of Versailles, that is, France, SK, were no secret. In the notorious Mein Kampf, declaring that France is the mortal enemy of the Reich, and so on. Why Taylor had to act so stupidly, I don't know. Perhaps out of habit, which the general was quite capable of. Litvinov, starting from 1933, had his whole tongue calloused about these secret plans, and the ears of all Europe were buzzing about them. But you had to read Mein Kampf wisely." Hitler, for example, analyzed the possible directions of Germany's European policy in the period before the First World War and wrote this. Germany could pursue a policy of conquest of new lands in Europe only in alliance with England against Russia. Let's not forget that at that time Russia also included Russian Poland, not really needed by Russia, but rather completely unnecessary. SK. But also vice versa. Germany could pursue a policy of conquering colonies and strengthening its world trade only with Russia against England. Emphasis here and below is mine. SK. And further. In this case, it was necessary to draw the appropriate conclusions and, above all, to send Austria to hell as soon as possible. Thanks to the alliance with Austria, Germany lost all the best and richest prospects for concluding other alliances. On the contrary, its relations with Russia and even with Italy became increasingly tense. Once Germany set a course for a policy of enhanced industrialization and enhanced development of trade, then, essentially speaking, there was no longer the slightest reason left to fight against Russia. Only the worst enemies of both nations were interested in such enmity arising. So much for the Russophobe. And bearing in mind a possible new military situation, Hitler considered two options in Chapter Z: a future war of Germany in alliance with Europe against Russia and a war of Germany in alliance with Russia against Europe. True, he wrote this. I do not forget all the arrogant threats that pan-Slavist Russia dared to systematically shower on Germany. I do not forget the trial mobilizations that Russia resorted to in order to infringe on Germany. However, just before the start of the war, World War I, SK, we still had a second road. We could rely on Russia against England. And then he added, now the situation has changed radically. If before the First World War we could suppress our feelings of resentment against Russia and still go with it against England, now this is out of the question. The future Führer himself explained why an alliance between Russia and Germany was now impossible. And it was not a matter of ideology, but the fact that Soviet Russia at the time Mein Kampf was written was very weak, and few believed that it was capable of defending at least itself, let alone supporting some ally. There were other circumstances. Here is Hitler's line of reasoning. Between Germany and Russia lies the Polish state, which is entirely in the hands of France. In the event of a German-Russian war against Western Europe, Russia, before sending at least one soldier to the German front, would have to endure a victorious struggle with Poland, with which, several years before the writing of Mein Kampf, the USSR fought an unsuccessful war. S2. The reasoning for the 20s and even for later times is very reasonable. Hitler was right, alas, in another way. From a purely military point of view, a war between Germany and Russia against Western Europe, or rather, in this case, against the whole world, would be a real disaster for us. After all, the whole struggle would have taken place not on Russian, but on German territory, and Germany would not even be able to count on serious support from Russia. What is there to argue about? At that time, the following statement of the future Führer was a sad truth. There is no need to talk about Russia as a serious technical factor in the war. We could not oppose almost anything to the general motorization of the world, which will play a colossal and decisive role in the next war. Germany itself is shamefully lagging behind in this important area. But in the event of war, it would still have to support Russia out of its little, because Russia does not yet have a single factory of its own that could actually make, say, a real living truck. What kind of war would this be? We would simply be beaten. The mere fact of concluding an alliance between Germany and Russia would mean the inevitability of a future war, the outcome of which is predetermined, the end of Germany. That is why an alliance with the new Russia seemed impossible to Hitler. But Stalin and the new Russia did not at all believe that they would always be a weak outsider partner. Already in 1931, about one-third, and in 1932, about half of the world's total exports of machinery and equipment were sent to the USSR. But in the mid-1920s, we still had to prove and show the strength and potential of Russia. And there was only one way to prove this to the whole world, that is, including Hitler, to build such a powerful industrial and developed power, to conclude an honest alliance with which any state, both large and small, would consider it an honor and benefit. This is precisely what those Bolsheviks of the Lenin-Stalin formation, for whom Russia was no less dear than Germany to the Führer, intended to do in Russia. And precisely because of their Russian patriotism, they could not discount Germany. I have already written about Krupp's agricultural concession in the Don province, that the Germans initially wanted to negotiate better conditions for themselves, and Russia had to threaten that a large Russian order for steam locomotives might not be placed in Germany. However, in reality, by the end of 1921, out of 950 steam locomotives purchased abroad, only 200 were supplied to us by Sweden and 750 by Germany. And this trend in our relations with the outside world continued throughout the 20s. Chapter 4. Hitler in 1923, the Russian-German Society Culture and Technology was founded. In fact, it was a Russian-German branch of the Union of German Engineers, at that time the largest and most powerful socio-technical organization in the whole world. Powerful. This is how the chairman of the Supreme Council of the National Economy, Valerian Kubyshev, defined the significance of this organization in a memo to the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, Stalin, dated November 22, 1928. By the way, the honorary chairman of the Culture and Technology Society was Albert Einstein himself. In the same 1923, the beer hall putsch of the 34-year-old German politician of Austrian origin, Adolf Hitler, failed in Munich. Years passed. Soviet-German ties were strengthened and expanded, although there were failures due to the fault of both sides. The influence of Hitler's party, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, NSDAP, also strengthened, although not without failures. And no one, not even Hitler himself, knew then that the fate of this man, who stood out sharply from the number of other political leaders, would be closely connected with the historical destinies of both Germany and Russia. But the fact that Germany and Russia are closely connected and should be closely connected was clear in the 20s to any smart Russian and any smart German. Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, the German ambassador to Russia, who became him in 1922 after the conclusion of the Treaty of Rapallo, was dying in the fall of 1928. After his death, Ernst von Brockdorff-Rantzau, the twin brother of the deceased, wrote to Chicherin, "My brother called me to his bed and asked me to inform you, People's Commissar, that his last and firm hope is the hope that the German and Russian peoples can jointly achieve the goal they desire." and on January 14, 1929, the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR, Alexei Ivanovich Rykov, talked with the new German ambassador to the USSR, Herbert von Dirksen. Dirksen arrived in Moscow a week ago, had already been received by Kalanin, and now, having met with the Soviet premier, he told him, "I see my task in strengthening Soviet-German relations and ask, in case of special need on certain important issues, to contact you personally, Mr. Chairman. You can contact me whenever you consider it necessary, Mr." Ambassador Rykov immediately assured him, "Germany is a specific country for us due to historical reasons, and therefore our rapprochement is inevitable, especially under the conditions of the Versailles system." Dirksen nodded understandingly. "Yes. Before I had time to settle down in your capital, I was already involved in the events of the German Engineering Week, and at a reception at our embassy, Mr. Mikoyan and I just talked about this." That's it, Rykov picked up. "The high level of technical culture in Germany encourages us at the current stage of our development to take special interest in our relationship with you. Moreover, the economy also determines the corresponding policy. Well, Mr. Chairman, I am sure that our further political rapprochement is possible, and the political rapprochement of the two countries, the bourgeois Weimar Republic and the proletarian Soviet Union, was, it must be said, in principle quite possible. In fact, it would then mean not so much a political partnership, this was just unlikely, if not impossible, but a refusal to participate in external alliances directed against one of the parties. The former winners still did not want to accept Germany into some new European concert as a full participant, but it could also be that the desire of the Anglo-French, and even more so of America, to have the Germans as an additional lever of their anti-Soviet policy would outweigh the Versailles arrogance. In 1925, a conference was held in Switzerland, in Locarno, which precisely provided Germany with some formal equality among other European powers, and precisely because England, and therefore the USA, wanted to ensure the possibility of creating such a bloc against the USSR, in which Weimar Germany would also participate. The Germans then managed to wriggle out and did not destroy the spirit of Rapallo, although objectively Locarno was directed precisely against Rapallo. Moreover, in 1926 a Soviet-German treaty on non-aggression and neutrality was concluded in Berlin. Alas, despite this, the idea of political rapprochement on the basis of solid peaceful coexistence and non-interference in each other's internal affairs had not only supporters but also enemies in both countries. On May 1, 1929, Dirksen's first Moscow year, a model of an imperialist battleship flying the German flag, was carried before the German ambassador, who stood on the podium of the diplomatic corps at a May Day demonstration. Dirksen saw this as an insult to Germany, and he was right. If someone wanted to hang someone's specific flag on the model, then there was only one politically correct option: the British Union Jack. Immediately after the demonstration, Dirksen rushed to see Deputy People's Commissar Karakan, but he did not receive him. It turned out strange. Recently Rykov himself expressed his readiness to accept the German ambassador if necessary without any delay, but here the German was refused only by the Deputy Commissar. Only on May 3, the still unrestrained Dirksen was received by a member of the NKID board, Stamoniakov. "I am ashamed of German-Soviet relations, Mr. Stamoniakov. Why was it necessary to bring joy to our common enemies? Mr. Ambassador, you communicated with Comrade Karakan, and I cannot anticipate his official answer," Stamoniakov replied importantly. Then he paused and continued, "I can express my personal opinion. I have not been to Red Square, but the 1st of May has long been a national holiday in our country, and the procession often has a carnival character. You can't make such a model in 2 hours," Dirksen objected passionately. "It was prepared in advance, and it was possible." Well, the authorities are simply physically unable to control all the posters, caricatures and figures that each group produces on its own initiative and carries around the city. Stamoniakov was emphatically polite and, spreading his hands, said, "I don't see any mockery of the German flag in the fact that there was a small German flag on the model of the battleship, but the column that carried the battleship led the entire May Day procession." Dirksen again disagreed. "Completely by accident." "Without a doubt, completely by accident," a member of the board reassured the ambassador. It was explained to Dirksen that, supposedly, at some factory the workers decided to make a model of an armadillo in order to laugh at the patriotism of the German Social Democrats. Dear reader, I am far from thinking that this seemingly pin provocation with a small German flag was planned at a very high level. But nothing here can be explained by chance. The May Day demonstration in Moscow is not a procession in Novokopsk, and in this muddy drop of water all the dirt of the Comintern's hopeless incitement of the proletarian revolution in Germany came to light quite clearly. 4 years will pass. Moscow's German ambassador Herbert von Dirksen will arrive in Berlin in the spring of 1933 to report to the new Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler. Shortly before this, on March 23, Hitler gave his famous speech to the Reichstag on the foreign policy of the Third Reich, where the tone regarding relations with the USSR was quite positive, and now Dirksen wanted to understand, during a personal and confidential meeting with the head of state, that this was a political phrase or a real course, a small detail. When later the same Dirksen was appointed ambassador to Great Britain, Hitler would never find time to receive him, or rather, he would simply refuse to receive him. But he received Dirksen, the current ambassador to the USSR, on the precisely appointed day, although he later complained that he had to sit in the reception room for almost an hour. Entering the Führer's office, Dirksen immediately began reporting after mutual greetings. Hitler listened attentively and favorably. Then he asked a few questions. Dirksen answered and asked the question himself. "Mr. Reich Chancellor, to what extent should we there, in Moscow, be guided in our daily work by the ideas of your speech on March 23? I was quite sincere then, Mr. Ambassador, and I am quite ready to maintain friendly relations with the Soviet Union, provided," here Hitler winced and finished, "on condition that the Russians do not interfere in the internal affairs of Germany." Another 7 years would pass and Hitler would give the order to prepare a plan for a preventive attack on the USSR. From a sober supporter of friendly relations with Russia, he will begin to turn into its reckless enemy. And perhaps that's why we never made a single serious attempt to figure it out on our own, without Alan Bullock, who was this German of Austrian origin for Germany and who could become for Russia. Of the thousands of books about Hitler, only a few dozen can be considered worthy of serious attention. And there are even fewer truly fundamental ones. This, firstly, is the only authentic, that is, completely reliable, book by Hitler himself, Mein Kampf. Next, a book whose text can be considered relatively authentic is the famous Table Talks, which was based on the shorthand notes of Heinrich Heim and Henry Picker. Then, in general, that's it. If we add to what has already been mentioned official verbatim reports of meetings with Hitler's participation, documents personally signed by him, texts of his speeches and official records such as the War Diary of General Halder, then impeccably reliable sources are, perhaps, exhausted by this. Why? Yes, if only because only what was written down, say, by the same Halder in the current time scale can be completely trusted. But it is unlikely that one can also unconditionally believe what was written later by the memoirist Halder. Here's an example. Count Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg is famous for the fact that in real history it was he who ruined the Führer's new trousers with the explosion of a bomb brought in a briefcase to an operational meeting in the Wolf's Lair in Reisenberg on July 20, 1944. Many years later, the elderly Halder spoke about his contacts with Stauffenberg like this. "We spent hours again and again analyzing the possibility of eliminating this monster. And when, if you believe Halder, in the second half of 40 and the first half of 41, what's the truth here? Well, firstly, the fact that Stauffenberg and Halder, connected by personal acquaintance, actually met more than once. It is also true that Halder was dissatisfied with the adventurism of the Führer in the late 30s, like almost the entire old Prussian generals. However, Halder himself was a Bavarian. But after the fall of Poland and especially after the fall of Paris, the grumbling temporarily ceased. This is also a fact. Everything else, of course, is a lie. It turns out that pedantic general staff officers also want to look pomaded in the eyes of history. The fact that in his notes for a report at a meeting of the chiefs of senior staff on December 13, 1940, Colonel General Halder wrote, "The solution to questions of hegemony in Europe rests on the struggle against Russia is a fact." He wrote about this in his diary, and this fact does not fit in any way with the statement that at the same time, Halder allegedly called the Führer a monster. No, then even the ardent Stauffenberg hardly used such expressions. Then, when the Reich received Europe not thanks to the generals but despite its resistance to Hitler's plans, the Major and the Colonel General probably discussed nothing more than disturbing vague prospects for the development of events. Halder was removed by Hitler in 1942. Stauffenberg was shot at midnight on July 20, 1944, in the headlights of a military truck. So after the war that took place in real history, Halder could freely pose as an anti-Nazi hero. And he's not the only one. Even Walter Schellenberg, in his post-war memoirs, gave such a literary portrait of his former Führer that at least publish it in Pravda. Therefore, my dear reader, it does not prevent us from reflecting at least a little on the array of documentary and pseudo-documentary sources. A relatively reliable part of them are the few memoirs of those who really knew Hitler well over many years in various situations, different environments and an important circumstance. They are not trying to make the Führer a petty neurasthenic or a fiend of hell. And, I must say, there were very few of them. Almost everyone close to him or standing nearby saw the light, or they remember such piquant things that could be well paid for, and were well paid for, by the Anglo-Saxons. It's possible to understand them, after all, but they had to be denazified without fail. But the better we understand them, the less confidence we will have in them as witnesses. Purely selfish or, to put it mildly, mercantile interest could seriously influence even such isolated memoirists as Joachim von Ribbentrop. He wrote his memoirs already in Nuremberg prison, being almost sure of a death sentence. What was left? On the one hand, the Führer's grand diplomat certainly wanted to provide some income for the future widow, Anneliese von Ribbentrop. Provide, even in such an indirect way, how to write memoirs that can become a commodity. He probably wanted to at least somehow whitewash himself before history. We couldn't help but think, what if we managed to escape? But how? The prudent diplomat understood that it was impossible to flatter the Russians under any conditions, but it was possible to flatter the Allies. And anti-Sovietism, quite moderate, because it was impossible to go too far, turned out to be useful here. Isn't this where Ribbentrop's evidence comes from that Hitler went satanic at the mere word Russia? After all, if so, then Ribbentrop is not to blame for, say, the breakdown of the Soviet-German pact. Everything was programmed by the Führer's position. Isn't this where the shadowing of the boss's anti-Jewish views comes from? And this is certainly where the exceptional praise for the English island comes from, which Ribbentrop puts into Hitler's mouth. And here you believe more in the later note of Ribbentrop's widow, who reports that Hitler considered the publication of the foreign policy chapter of Mein Kampf to be his biggest mistake. But this chapter is known primarily for its apology for the campaign to the East. But Ribbentrop's high overall personal assessment of Hitler is valuable for its undoubted accuracy. Firstly, it was made in conditions when it was more profitable to denigrate and belittle the former boss as much as possible. But with Ribbentrop we see the opposite. Secondly, it was given by a man at the end of his life, rich in long meetings with almost all the main figures of the then world political process, except perhaps Roosevelt. That is, there was something to compare with and with whom. And here, before his death, Ribbentrop did not bend his soul. Not everyone was capable of this. Even Hitler's favorite Speer managed to denazify to great effect, and in his memoirs he sometimes simply slandered his boss, for example, denying him a sense of humor. However, even in Speer's memoirs, genuine intonation creeps in every now and then. and it proves that the real Hitler was not at all like the flat, featureless and foul-smelling sewage irrigation fields. Rather, it can be compared to a mountain range where there are picturesque valleys, dangerous screes and gloomy gorges. Moreover, such an array through which it was difficult, but possible, to build tunnels leading in exactly opposite directions. So Speer can often be trusted, although it is also beneficial for him to highlight, say, his role as the savior of Germany from the Führer's supposed passion for the total destruction of the Reich's economy. Speer persistently emphasizes that Hitler allegedly ordered the whole of Germany to be blown up to hell, and Speer, they say, sabotaged such directives. Although the Allies completely destroyed Germany, and mainly cities not factories. In March 1945 alone, Anglo-American aviation dropped more than 200,000 tons of bombs on Germany. 10 Hiroshimas, and all this, for some reason, did not break the back of the Reich's military economy. There is a very non-standard book by the American Richard Sezulli called Ig Farben, which I will refer to later. An economist and journalist, Sezulli had a rare opportunity after the war to become acquainted with both the archives of the Reich and its economy. So, he wrote that if fuel, materials, repairs and transport were provided, the economy could operate at almost 90% of its maximum capacity. But maybe the reader will object, it was precisely thanks to Speer who kept the factories against the will of the Führer. How to say? Richard Sezulli saw something different in defeated Germany. On a lawn in a Bavarian forest stands an unfinished building with a vaulted roof, about 800 m long, more than 90 m wide at the base, and more than 30 m high. It was intended for the Messerschmitt aircraft manufacturing plant. The plant was buried in the ground. The thickness of the dome was 6 meters. And this construction, which began only in August 1944, was continued by the Reich until mid-April 1945 when the states entered this zone. So, it seems that Speer was blaming too much from his sick head onto the Führer's dead head, including Speer's stories about orders for total senseless destruction. Fortunately, Hitler didn't care anymore, but Speer had to get away from the news. Among other things, his statements clearly diverge from the ideas of Hitler's will, the authenticity of which is not disputed and in which Hitler does not curse the German people, but directs them to continue the further battle of the nation and continuing the construction of the National Socialist state. Hitler was not so stupid as not to understand that without factories and economic infrastructure you cannot fight and you cannot build anything worthwhile. So it's unlikely that he thoughtlessly ordered everything to hell to blow up and blow up. There are more serious cases. Let's say it's a difficult question. How should we feel about the assessment of Hitler by the famous Hermann Rauschning? The latter called the Führer a beast from the abyss. But Rauschning himself, with his biography, provides grounds for a particularly close investigation of his integrity and truthfulness. This biography is too contradictory at its different stages. However, behind its external illogicality one can also discern some interesting logic, set perhaps not only by Rauschning himself. When Rauschning suddenly joined the NSDAP in 1932, he was 45 years old. Coming from an old cadet family, he had behind him studies in Cadet Corps, World War I, lieutenant shoulder straps, injury, music and history studies. So, a person is educated, respectable, talented and capable of sober thought, not at all restless in a youthful way, and where it seems to rush, not a boy. Hitler was 2 years younger. Rauschning quickly became one of the leader's closest advisors, and in the same year he was appointed president of the Danzig Senate. Deeply involved in politics, he was, of course, familiar with the ideas of the Bible of the party, Mein Kampf. This means that he also knew how the leader of the party treated bourgeois parliamentarism, Jewry and the rest. He later stated, "What Hitler actually wants is not contained in Mein Kampf," but Goebbels said the opposite. But it is not he who refutes Rauschning, but the text of Mein Kampf itself. If anything could have changed compared to the ideas of 23, it was Hitler's views on Russia, which is what happened in the rational version of his epic, which I intend to tell later. The Danzig regional Führer kept pace with the Gross Führer even when the big-faced bestial Rem was the idol of semi-criminal stormtroopers, and he walked alongside him after the Reichstag fire, after the night of the long knives which bloodily removed Rem and his supporters from politics. However, in 1936, Rauschning, this already very prominent Nazi, suddenly made a sharp break with Nazism, and through Switzerland he emigrates to England. For some reason he has been silent for 3 years. Then he hastily writes one revelatory book after another over the course of 3 years. Then suddenly, he goes into the shadows, and for some reason he has been farming in Oregon since 1948. The occupation for the former head of the German Cultural Society in Poland is just right. So, another strange figure at first glance, a strange fate. What's interesting? During the first 3 years of his emigration, Rauschning did not make any revelations. Did you write slowly? No. Since 1939, he has published 5 books at once. The first, Revolution of Nihilism, frightens the West with the prospect of an alliance between Hitler and Stalin. The hint is obvious, the West needs to quickly come to an agreement with Hitler itself. But Stalin, having seen enough of the third-rate envoys of the West, all sorts of retired and semi-retired Reichs and Dumenkos, whom the West, clearly mocking, sent to Moscow for negotiations that the West obviously doomed to failure, outplays the Anglo-French and actually concludes a pact with Germany. A world war begins, and the revelations of Rauschning, who had been practically silent until then, begin. The question is, why was he silent for so long? After all, in his hands were, as he himself assured, authentic recordings of the Führer's thoughts since 1933-34, and they, it seems, really were. But what did Rauschning's literary talents make of them? Something that, with an outwardly negative description of Hitler's personality, could become the ideological basis for any Western policy towards the Führer, both loyal and repressive. And it turns out that Rauschning's books are not so much documentary evidence as political pamphlets, where the main thing is the fulfillment of the social order of some influential forces. The nature of these forces today can only be guessed at, but perhaps the key to this riddle may be how Rauschning, approx. Lennox 555, well aware of Hitler's extreme anti-Jewishness but who voluntarily joined his party, assesses the role of Jewry several years after leaving the Führer. The Jewish intellect played a huge role in the process of liberation of the human spirit, made every effort to ensure that this process developed further. Could an educated, cultured person be sincere in such thoughts? And what, then, one wonders, is the role of Aristotle and Democritus, Socrates and Lucretius, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Thomas More, the galaxy of Italians of the Renaissance, Luther, Rabelais, Montaigne, Copernicus, Jan Hus, Voltaire? Who can Jews delegate to this circle on equal terms? Spinoza. So, after all, he was the spiritual brainchild of Giordano Bruno and Bacon, and the Jewish community of Amsterdam subjected him to the great excommunication and cast him out of themselves. Marx. But no one said more damning words about Jewry as a social phenomenon than Karl Marx. So, with a positive and, of course, deserved assessment of the Jewish contribution to world culture, Rauschning was not shy about excessive praise. When assessing Hitler, he used only black, hellish tones. Given this, Rauschning cannot be rejected as a witness, but he should not be thoughtlessly trusted either. But he is usually considered almost the main striking force in the ideological accusation of Hitler. All biographers of Hitler rely on stories about his youth from 2 former friends, Guzel Kubitschek and Reinhold Hanisch. From what Kubitschek says, one can see a shy but quite normal person who, by the way, feels himself normal in sexual terms. Hanisch is much less credible. He clearly makes things up every now and then. And the biographers almost all as one reveal complete analytical helplessness or vice versa, virtuoso abilities to distort, unanimously repeat each other, and ultimately, the same Kubitschek and Hanisch. No one even tries to go beyond these semi-mythical witnesses, but if you look at Hitler's later path, at his reserves of free time in the future, it becomes clear that it was in Vienna that Hitler did a lot of self-education, and this very word may be the key to his years youth. When the war began, he was 25 years old. Universities take place in the trenches, but they are very unique. Then he almost immediately went into practical politics, and again there was no time for books. And Hitler knew a lot, and precisely in the style of a classic talented self-taught person who devotes all the strength of his mind and heart and all his free time to self-education. At the same time, scattered, not detailed, not commercial memories, including the memories of frontline comrades, do not diverge in the general psychological description of the personality. Modest, sympathetic, accommodating, courageous, with a developed sense of camaraderie and humor. But these are cursory assessments, not normative, as Rauschning's works are considered. And here is another basic memoirist, the huge Patsy, kid, Patzig in German, also funny, Hanf Stengel, who was next to Hitler for a decade and a half from the early 20s until the spring 37th. The example of Ernst Franz Zedwig Hanf Stengel is so interesting and curious that it is worth dwelling on in more detail and seriously. After all, in the fate of Patsy there is strangeness upon strangeness. But aren't there some overseas quotes in his oddities? Patsy, indeed, knew Hitler very well, but it was believed that in his immediate circle he played the role of a cheerful social minion with diverse talents, including musical and buffoonery. He was 6 years older than Göring, 7 years older than Hess, 10 years older than Goebbels, 13 years older than Himmler and Bormann, 17 years older than Heydrich, and even if only 2 years older than Hitler himself. However, in this circle, where everyone except the Führer were much younger, less educated and, incidentally, shorter than Patsy, almost 2 meters tall, Hanf Stengel never acquired either a serious reputation or a truly serious situation. And he was with Hitler at a time when the same Rauschning, a man younger than Patsy, reached considerable heights in 6 months. This even caused grumbling from the old guard. Why didn't it work out for Patsy? What's the matter? After all, Hanf Stengel was far from being as simple as he seemed. Born in Munich into the family of a wealthy antiquarian and an American woman naturalized in Germany, at the age of 18 he went to study at Harvard University for some reason. This was explained by the fact that he was supposed to manage the American branch of the family business on Fifth Avenue in New York. Considering that Ernst intended to sell not soap or starched collars but paintings and antiques, then the choice of America as a place of study looked more than strange. Nearby are Munich with its old Pinakothek, Italy, the Louvre, Dutch galleries, London, and the young giant is going to study in a country where Gioconda is well known only because her smile successfully promotes the advertising of goods. However, maybe just for the advanced development of this artistic and commercial experience did our big man choose education in the New World. If so, then he did not particularly succeed in this field. One way or another, in 1909 Harvard University graduated. But the ardent patriot, according to his assurances, eager to serve the country of his ancestors, is in no hurry to return to his homeland. And possessing fists of pounds and iron health, he will live to be 88 years old. He spends the entire First World War in the States. At this time, Hitler, of his own free will, breathes the stale air of a soldier's dugout, shaken by nearby shell explosions. The World War ended, and in 1921, with a beautiful wife and 1-year-old son, the prodigal son suddenly returned to that same Germany, where he was in no hurry during the years of its prosperity before the war, but moved when it lay in ruins and was begging. America was just burping, devouring the richest pie of fabulous war profits. But maybe the family of the future Patsy didn't even get a crumb from him. No, apparently something went wrong. In any case, he had money. Although it is not entirely clear where he got them from, and quite a lot. Inflation ruined his father's company. Matters with the division of the remainder of the fortune became complicated, but Ernst had an open house in Munich, a rich estate in Uffing, and substantial sums in his hands. Further, the story of the future press secretary of the NSDAP twists in such a way that one is left either surprised or grinning. Let's take a closer look, dear reader, at it, and maybe then we will understand who Hanf Stengel really was. So, the happy father of the family plunges headlong into research about the Bavarian philanthropist King Ludwig I, cases that are almost half a century old. It would seem that the problems of our time remain behind the walls of a cozy mansion. And suddenly, in the life of the future memoirist, author of the book Hitler, the last years, such strange suddenly were already, I repeat, in abundance, and there will be even more. The blue-eyed brunette Hanf Stengel is attracted to the blue-eyed, what a coincidence. Brown-haired man Hitler. Yes, he doesn't just enthusiastically read it there, but introduces him to Munich salons, gives $1,000 to buy equipment for the party newspaper Volkischer Beobachter. You need to know what such a sum meant in such a currency in post-Versailles Germany in 1922. King Ludwig was firmly put aside, if, however, our Patsy was ever actually involved in him. Now he is the chief of the press service of the NSDAP. For an aristocratic rogue, the occupation and company are poorly explained. However, Patsy completely immerses himself in it. Masterly performance by Liszt, then again a coincidence. Wagner, adored by Hitler, and to the stormy music of the great author of Valkyrie, Patsy goes through life with the Führer, and only with the Führer. New Year 1933 at the beautiful Villa Hanf Stengel. Hitler writes in their family album, "The first day of the new year. This year belongs to us. I confirm this in writing." But less than 3.5 years had passed when the Führer's favorite, who seemed to have gone through the crucible of failures and difficult struggles during the period of the first triumphs of the Reich, suddenly ran away behind the cordon. Route. By another coincidence, it is the same as Rauschning's through Switzerland to London. Patsy had enough imagination, and later he told the world the story of his escape, which was as confusing as it was exciting. The main reason for portraying Patsy was supposedly Göring's desire, with whom the fugitive had been on friendly terms for years, to throw him out, having not pleased Goebbels with a parachute over the territory of the Spanish Republicans. And for some reason the damned Reds had to immediately liquidate him, after which a satisfied Goebbels would immediately burst into a stream of tears over the heroic death of a veteran of the movement. Further, the biographers disagree. Either Hanf Stengel was interned in England before the war, although no one interned Rauschning, and he wrote his pamphlets in London, or in the USA after the war, although why then? One thing is certain. During the war, Hanf Stengel was an expert on Nazism in an institution whose head was Patsy's longtime club friend and Harvard classmate. The establishment was called the White House, and the friend's name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the age of 70, the former Patsy kid returned to Munich, receiving back the confiscated fortune and the very Villa House Tiefland, where he met the Führer in the year that made him chancellor. So why does Hanf Stengel's life resemble the plot of a bad novel? I think we can find the answer from the hero of this novel himself. After all, if a liar lies a lot, lies enthusiastically and for many years, then his self-control inevitably weakens. If he cuts up the story page by page to prepare a salad of truth and fiction, then he sometimes lets it slip, and in the desire to provide the appearance of credibility and frankness, sometimes dangerous things are said. Therefore, from the written words of Hanf Stengel himself, it remains to say the last thing. Back in 1921, he was introduced to the Nazis through another Harvard friend, counselor of the U.S. Embassy in Berlin Robbins, by the embassy's deputy military attaché, Captain Truman Smith. But why was it necessary to introduce Smith to Hanf Stengel? According to the latter's assurances, Smith needed Ernst, who had arrived in Munich 3 months earlier and after a 16-year absence, to introduce the captain to the military officials of Bavaria. Reader. In crushed Germany, thanks to the USA, in the early 1920s, American diplomats felt more confident than at home overseas. In Germany at that time they were not guests but hosts. And imagine, reader, this picture. The number one military diplomat of the world power in a defeated, disenfranchised and powerless country cannot find a more suitable and influential figure, and for what? And in order to arrange meetings with the military elite of Bavaria. It turns out that in all of Germany there was no better intermediary for this than the modest son of a bankrupt antique dealer. A thoroughly civilian man, known only for his height, his laughter, and speaking English better than German. And this not even a week, but just a 3-month Munich resident introduces Captain Truman into the circle, where he meets with the heir to the Bavarian throne Ruprecht Wittelsbach, General Ludendorff, the future ruler of Bavaria Gustav von Kahr, Count Hugo Lerchenfeld. Marvelous. Inexplicable. I think, yes, but not really. Captain Truman Smith was, as usual, an assistant military attaché for appearances but worked in military intelligence. There can hardly be any doubt, taking into account what has just been said, that Hanf Stengel, Hanfi, as he was nicknamed at Harvard, was no stranger to this department. So there is every reason to believe that all this was a brilliantly conceived operation to introduce Hanfi among extreme German nationalists. It began successfully and successfully stretched over many turbulent years. However, the place for Hanfi was chosen wisely all the time in front of the authorities, and responsibility was taken care of. The reputation of a jester was an excellent mask here. But apparently, this rope wound just until March 37, after which it was necessary to urgently invent stories in the style of the famous detective Nat Pinkerton. Well, he already served a considerable amount of time, not like Rauschning. He turned out to be weaker and did not last so many years under Hitler. In 1937, Hitler had absolutely no need to quarrel with gentlemen from overseas. And why was it open to admit that? It seems, for so many years the watchful eye of Uncle Sam had been looking over the Führer's shoulder into his secrets. While the party was coming to power, this, perhaps, even helped. But now, when really serious matters began, when delicate plans had to be put into action, now Patsy Hanfi became redundant. Obviously, this is why stories about parachutes came into play. Many people caught on them, including Speer, who innocently related the incident with Patsy Hanfi in his own memoirs. But from the words of Patsy, thousands of authors talk about Hitler allegedly lying at the feet of Patsy's wife about the scandals in the NSDAP after the failure of the 1923 putsch, about the murder of his beloved niece, and not only, perhaps, the niece Hitler Gellerabel, allegedly sanctioned by Hitler, and about much, much more. After all, Hanf Stengel is the long-time head of the press service of the party leadership, the organizer of Hitler's election campaigns. After the failure of the coup, the Führer hid in his house. And very often it is this former press secretary who is taken as the main witness. How, say, Eva Braun's confession is so exhausted. As a woman, Hitler is of no use to me. But the editors of the confession also belong to Patsy. By the way, the famous researcher of the problem of Hitler, the Paul Marian Podkoisky, considers Hanf Stengel's memoirs to be the only reliable document about the life of the Führer of that period. Yes, you can't say anything, the assessment is clearly deserved. And Rauschning and Hanf Stengel and another former press secretary of the NSDAP, Otto Dietrich, had undoubted literary talents, and they knew Hitler closely. You can't take that away from them. And for this reason alone, in what they wrote there is a lot of reliable information, a truthful reconstruction of Hitler's words and views. But due to their biographies and personal qualities, they cannot be truthful in general. They must lie. And they lied, mixing the truth with clever fiction convenient for them or their customers, direct slander or cheating substitution of facts, situations, statements, ideas. Obviously, Schellenberg and others like him were not inferior to them, who managed to get along with the British and Yankees at the cost of distorting the truth. What can we say about the memories of the servants, those who were not close but lived nearby for years? After the war, these little people had only one big capital in their hands, their former closeness to the Führer. And one could have guessed in advance that they would manage it precisely as capital, wanting to get as much interest on it as possible. So the blowardiness of these memoirs was ensured from the very beginning. And stories begin that the Führer did not allow himself to be seen in a negligee, so he appeared before people only washed, clean-shaven, dressed and necessarily wearing a tie. In addition, he washed his hair every day and completely washed his body, brushed his teeth and rinsed his mouth after every meal, shaved twice a day, was neat, clean, thrifty and thrifty to the smallest detail. clearly a pervert. From book to book, there are meaningful hints that Hitler did not like to be naked. Well, he really wasn't recorded on nudist beaches, but there are photographs of him in the Bavarian national costume. And this, by the way, is an open shirt without a tie. Short leather pants, knee-length stockings and black low shoes. There are also these lines from Mein Kampf: the dress should serve the cause of educating young people. That young guy who walks around in long pants in the summer, wrapped up to the neck, is already doing harm to the cause of his physical training. Moreover, it is interesting how the perception of the past by some minor figures in big history can be distorted over decades. Traudl Jung was in the real Hitler's bunker almost until the end. Here she is in a wartime photograph in the Salon restaurant of the Führer's personal special train, smoking at the same table with her friend and husband, Hitler's servant Hans Jung. She looks at the photographs, a girl charming in her intellectual mediocrity, animated by her involvement in the elite. Then she fell silent for many years, but when the persistent newspapermen prevail, you have to be at the level of the topic. And there are profound revelations that Hitler realized the loss of the war after Stalingrad, and yet he continued it. This was his crime, and so on. Where did the technical secretary have such detailed knowledge of Hitler's strategic assessments of the situation? Charming even in her old age, Traudl has read many times about what she is talking about, and now even she herself is sure that what she said is the historical truth. Although such evidence of hers is not even worth a penny, she tells the truth, and a very interesting one, when she talks about a man whom, together with other young secretaries, she entertained with chatter at the dinner table. And what is clear from this story is not a possessed tyrant or a mystic poser, but a completely normal character. By the way, with a well-developed sense of humor, albeit not always refined. Here, the former secretary of the Führer has all the details clearly correct. Why lie to the little man when the situation is long behind him? The myth of demon possession was beneficial, and is still beneficial to large people who want to hide behind this fiction from personal responsibility for their own affairs. Alas, historians, not to mention writers, are too often content with unpretentious fairy tales instead of sober logic, which allows them to remember that any person is always a person. And if his behavior is outwardly illogical, then, as a rule, it has a completely logical reason. The real Hitler could not have become what he became if he did not have not just a will, but a strong will and a stable psyche with a developed ability for self-control. I would like to see a psychopath thoughtfully studying photographs of himself in various oratorical poses taken by a party photographer specifically in order to polish the skill of the leader's speeches. Demosthenes, who delivered speeches before the roaring sea with pebbles in his mouth, would clearly have done the same in the 20th century. But Demosthenes is cited as an example of concentrated persistence, and Hitler is presented as an impulsive neurasthenic who made speeches on a whim and in mystical ecstasy. Von Derksen later stated that Hitler did not leave a strong impression on him and that the Führer lacked the self-confidence and dignity of a truly strong character. Well, there may not have been complete internal composure of character. For an emotional person this is not so unexpected, but Hitler still had a lot of self-confidence and dignity. And to understand this, you don't even need to consult memoirists. It is enough to watch film documents carefully. However, Hitler before 1936 and Hitler already since 1941 are, in mental terms really, perhaps, two different people. Since 1935 Dr. Morel began to become the evil genius of the real Hitler. And it is very likely that it was not he himself, or not only himself, who developed the recipes and schemes for his daily injections, which certainly influenced the Führer's psyche. Erich Fromm, who had never seen Hitler, nevertheless claimed that he was a necrophiliac, that is, a lover of sexual exercises with corpses. Can you say this about a person who was clean to the point of pedantry, who took baths twice a day and refused broths which he called corpse tea? About the person who wrote, "We need, so that the object of vanity is not that a person has acquired a beautiful dress that others cannot buy, but that a person has a beautiful body, which anyone can achieve if they wish." This is also important for what follows. We need our girls to know their nights well. NYR. but Fromm's conscious ravings are carefully replicated and reproduced, and also obviously deliberately. Rauschning was no better when he wrote, hintingly, about boys who allegedly boasted that they were Hitler's lovers. That is, the one who introduced laws against homosexuals and in the SS punished sexual experimenters with the death penalty. But did the average reader of Rauschning know this when his books were written on the topic of the day, for the needs of customers? And does the average modern reader know this about Rauschning and Fromm? Why Rauschning? No one questions the authenticity of the transcripts that Bormann allegedly kept and then forwarded almost to his wife, who allegedly kept them in a secluded place. Of course, the wife of Bormann himself and husband and wife are one Satan. And Lev Bezimensky, considered a communist super expert on the Third Reich, enthusiastically quoted a 1959 Paris book in 1973. On February 6, 1945, Hitler said to Bormann, "The main task of Germany, the purpose of my life and the raison d'etre of National Socialism was the destruction of Bolshevism." This is how this nomenclature party Lev is seen, sitting in Bormann's pocket and also stenographing for safety. Because what can you take from Bormann? He has melted into the fog of history and now bribes from him are smooth. Neither he himself, nor his wife, nor the Parisian publishers of the transcripts will explain to us some strange circumstances. Firstly, in 1973 everyone knew that the war ended with the complete collapse of the Reich on May 9, 1945, and in February 1945 all that was clear was that the Reich was in a very difficult situation but was still very strong. The Red Army had not even begun to prepare for the assault on Königsberg. Just at the beginning of February, in the area of the Hungarian Lake Balaton, the Reich threw thunderous masses of Tigers and Ferdinands into battle. A little earlier, the 4th SS Panzer Corps on the Oshi-Balaton front had up to 560 tanks, that is 80-90 tanks and assault guns for every kilometer in the center of the proposed breakthrough. One Tiger or even Ferdinand at 12 meters. Our 1st Guards fortified area could have deployed 4 heavy machine guns, 4 anti-tank rifles and 2 guns at the same kilometer against this steel wave. In terms of manpower we were outnumbered there by 10 times, in artillery by 4 times and in tanks. Hero of the Soviet Union, General Nikolai Byryakov, who reported this, ends this way. But you can't even compare tanks, there's nothing with which. And this, in February 1945, this is a war, and in a war everything is unclear until it is over. And so, if you believe the Parisian publishers of the Bormann transcripts and the party Lev in these faithless days when heavy steel was thrown into the scales by one side or the other, the most prudent and devoted to the Führer Bormann kept secret transcripts and secretly passed them on to his wife or another to someone out there. For what? After all, the future is still unclear not only for Bormann, but even for Stalin. And if Bormann really did this, he would thereby commit moral treason against the Führer. But we know for sure that he remained faithful to him to the end. So maybe it was Hitler himself who ordered the storage of transcripts of his conversations with Bormann so that Lev of Partocratic Analysis could later quote them. But in February 1945 the outcome of the struggle was not completely clear not only to Stalin but also to Hitler. No, it's your choice, reader, but these transcripts just don't add up. And that's not all. There is also secondly, this is the most tragic moment of Hitler's fate. He dictates his political will. The moment when the most cherished thoughts and feelings in the literal sense of the word are trusted not to the ears of Bormann Lev, who is eavesdropping from his pocket, but to paper. And at this moment of truth, Hitler did not even hint about Bolshevism. On April 29, 1945 at 4:00 am, with witnesses Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, this is where you can trust the authenticity of Bormann's autograph. Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs. Adolf Hitler signed his political will. It is not true that I or anyone else in Germany wanted war in 1939. It was desired and provoked by those international statesmen who were either themselves of Jewish origin or acted in Jewish interests. Centuries will pass, but even then, from the ruins of our cities and monuments, hatred will be revived against those whom we should thank for everything that happened. International Jewry and its accomplices. Just 3 days before the start of the German-Polish War, I proposed to the British ambassador in Berlin a solution to the German-Polish problem. It was rejected only because the leading circles of England wanted war. The fact is that these circles fell under the influence of the propaganda disseminated by international Jewry and were anticipating increased business activity. I also have no doubt that if the peoples of Europe are once again treated like ordinary stock shares, then the responsibility will fall on those who truly represent the guilty party in this bloody struggle. Jewry. The last words were, I instruct the leaders of the nation and those subordinate to them to ruthlessly confront the global poisoner of all nations, international Jewry. Next came the signature. Adolf Hitler. The capital of the Reich was stormed by people covered with the banners of Lenin. It was Bolshevik Russia that led the Führer to this final stroke of the pen. But he, who rejected the common path with them to resist the power of capital, who did not keep the agreement with them, did not have any accusing words for the Bolsheviks in his last earthly hour. The post-war stenographers completed them for him. Fortunately, the post-war customers had something to pay them with. The anticipation of increased business activity mentioned by the Führer shed over America the second golden rain in the 20th century, which came from clouds that had gathered in Europe from tears, blood and smoke from conflagrations. And here's another myth. Hitler's conversations in his close circle are, according to hundreds of books, endless hours-long monologues. But if you pick up Table Talk, transcribed by Henry Picker, and read the longest one-time entry aloud yourself, it will take about 30 minutes, half an hour. So, presumably, there was enough time for other interlocutors to make statements. By the way, Trodeljan, who often sat at the same table with Hitler, recalls that he was not only an excellent storyteller, but also an equal listener. And how much has been written about Hitler's superficiality, illiteracy, and ignorance. Although in a deep exam on the universality of knowledge and the kind that is precisely necessary for a political leader, many of his colleagues in public administration are the same. Roosevelt, Truman would look pale in comparison with the Führer. Indeed, in addition to the tendency to persistent self-education, he also possessed absolute memory, just like Stalin. In this, that is, in the distortion of personality beyond recognition, the fate of Hitler, it must be said, is similar to the fate of Stalin. For various reasons, but neither one nor the other is fully understood. Both of them are slandered. The difference is that the real Hitler was unable to use his unique genius in such a way that distant history, where the true price of Rauschnings and Hanfstengels is already known, would appreciate and justify this genius. And the same story will sooner or later place the real Stalin in one of the first, if not first, places among the greatest government figures of mankind. Although he will note his biggest miscalculations and mistakes. By walking apart from Russia, the real Hitler completely missed his chance for greatness. But the real Stalin, unable to fully cooperate with the Reich, let it pass only partially. If they had gone together along the path of not real, but rational history, then they would have used these chances to the end, not only in the name of their exceptionally good glory, but also in the name of something greater, a new, more humane world. So how to get to the real Hitler? How can you see behind the deeply justified hatred of him, which involuntarily obscures the eyes of every Russian person, behind the dirty keyhole through which the Führer is shown to the West, and now to Russia, a complex and extraordinary person, unlike anyone else? General von Fritsch is known in his own right as a major figure in the Reichswehr of the Weimar Republic, and then in the resurgent Wehrmacht of the Third Reich. But he is even more famous for the fact that while being the commander-in-chief of the ground forces, he became inconvenient for some, was declared a homosexual and was dismissed from service. Then he was rehabilitated, returned to command positions, and then he died in battles near Warsaw in the fall of 1939. Witnesses of his death believed that the general was clearly seeking death. So, von Fritsch did not speak publicly, demonstrating loyalty, but in a strictly private conversation. This man is the fate of Germany, both in good and in evil. If he falls into the abyss now, he will take us all with him. Nothing can be done. The scale of the Führer's personality is outlined here quite clearly. And here's what the very intelligent Wehrmacht tank Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin wrote about Hitler in 1956. The development of our tank forces undoubtedly owes a lot to Adolf Hitler. Guderian's proposals to mechanize the army met significant resistance from a number of influential generals. Hitler became deeply interested in them. He not only acquired deep knowledge in technical issues related to motorization and tanks, but also showed himself to be an adherent of Guderian's strategic and tactical views. Hitler was personally present at the testing of new tanks, and his government did everything possible to develop the domestic engine industry and build highways. Mellenthin, who at one time observed Hitler personally for a long time and later became an excellent frontline officer after World War he ended up in an American camp for 2.5 years. The circle of his interlocutors was motley, from the Reich Minister Schwerin to the famous glider pilot Hanne Reich, who spoke with the Führer in April 1945. Hitler brought the general behind the barbed wire instead of the headquarters table. And therefore we can believe in the sincerity of Mellenthin, who, after long, frank conversations with people in the immediate circle of the Führer, after everything was already behind him, said this: glorifying the infallible genius of Hitler is as irresponsible and frivolous as declaring him the greatest criminal of all time. Hitler undoubtedly had a great mind and a remarkable memory. He also had enormous willpower and was completely ruthless. In politics and diplomacy, he showed an amazing ability to sense the weaknesses of his opponents and take full advantage of their mistakes. At first he was a healthy man, a vegetarian who never smoked or drank, but then he undermined his health by using stimulants. However, he retained amazing mental alertness and energy until the very end. This "until the very end" reader is, in my opinion, especially valuable and interesting. Mellenthin did not see Hitler at the end of the war, but some of his fellow prisoners dealt with the Führer right at the very end of his life. So this evidence deserves both attention and trust. And here is Jung, unspoiled by cleverness. The atmosphere was quite relaxed. Everything looked like a company with a good production climate. Nobody shouted Heil. We kept Hitler company at meals and tea parties. These were light, meaningless conversations. We chatted, note reader, we chatted and did not listen to the Führer (SK) about all sorts of things. He could ask us to talk about films, what's happening in fashion. He told me a lot himself, about the hobbies of his youth. He talked about Eva Braun, about his dog. He was prone to jokes. He told anecdotal stories from his life at the front. However, Speer, when from a political point of view a lie is not required, gives pictures of Hitler's amazing behavioral simplicity, where there is no smell of megalomania. Speer recalled that between 1934 and 1936 the Reich Chancellor and Führer could easily walk along the forest roads in the Obersalzberg area, accompanied by guests and 3 or 4 guards in civilian clothes from the Life Standard, and drink a glass of beer or a glass of milk in a mountain inn. And the crowd of numerous tourists did not recognize the head of the Reich in the man in the national Bavarian costume, walking like the others. But most interesting, perhaps, is the characterization of Hitler's personality that was given almost at the door to the scaffold by Ribbentrop. The latter circumstance makes it obviously one of the most reliable. Ribbentrop wrote, "For all the years of cooperation, I have not become closer to him on a human level than on the first day of our acquaintance, although I have experienced so much with him. There was something in his whole being that involuntarily prevented anyone from getting closer to him personally. Even when I first met Adolf Hitler, his personality made a strong impression on me. Even then I had the feeling that this man was a phenomenon completely out of the ordinary. What especially struck me was his complete isolation, but by no means his isolation. Hitler had a very special manner, unique to him alone, of expressing his point of view in such a way that the last word remained with him. He was by no means a man of compromise. Adolf Hitler's inaccessibility was not something predetermined, but came from his very character. As a person, he probably suffered from this himself. At the same time, he could be captivatingly kind, cordial and open. He could talk excitingly, with humor and even brilliant wit, about his youth, about his military service in the First World War and about the years of his internal political struggle. And when he spoke about art and architecture, one could feel how much of an artistic nature he was. When he wanted to win someone over to his side or get something out of his interlocutor, he did it with unsurpassed charm and the art of persuasion. Adolf Hitler's loyalty to people who once did something for him sometimes bordered on the incredible. On the other hand, he could be incomprehensibly gullible. He could even deliberately insult a person. This revealed a certain duality of his nature, which I could never fully understand. He carried the principle of divide and conquer to such an extent that almost all of his employees found themselves involved in severe internal conflicts. Another point is also important for assessing the personality of Adolf Hitler. He could fly into a blind rage and did not always know how to control himself. After one such incident during the war, he frankly told me, "You know, Ribbentrop, sometimes I can't control myself at all." The personality of Adolf Hitler was manifested both at large public rallies and in communication with politicians, military men, foreigners, as well as in a closer circle and in personal conversations. His belief in himself, combined with his ingenious, clear and simple way of expressing himself, was felt by many people, drawing them into his mainstream. It is very difficult to judge the nature of such a brilliant phenomenon as Adolf Hitler. It cannot be measured by ordinary standards. He was convinced of his role as the Messiah, considered himself destined by Providence to make Germany great. He had an unbending will and incredible energy in achieving his goals. His intelligence was enormous, and his ability to grasp everything on the fly was stunning. There can be no doubt that Adolf Hitler had only one goal in life: to serve the German people. He lived completely selflessly, sacrificed his health and until the last moment did not think about anything other than the future of his nation. The fact that he was defeated, the Führer, speaking to me, called fate. Why exactly he was defeated, history will decide. An honest, sober look allows us to understand not only why Hitler ended in collapse instead of triumph, but also more, whether the triumph could have continued for centuries. Hitler correctly identified one enemy of both his country and humanity, that international capital, which was completely devoid of any national roots. Rothschilds, Warburgs, DuPonts, Mellons, Morgans, Wallenbergs, Rockefellers, Kuhns, Kahns, Baracks, Ostriches, Lazars, Rosenwalds, Sulzbergers, Schiffs. It is not the irony of history, but its tragedy that was revealed in the fact that Hitler could not come to power without the help of this capital. But capital's finances became only starting blocks for him. Pushing off from them, he jumped to such a national height where his talent and ability to reach heights accessible only to him became visible to everyone. Capital gave him the opportunity to rise to power. Capital bet on him. And when the popularity of Nazism slowly began to decline by 1933, Capital put an end to the hesitation and secured him the chancellorship as an anti-communist. But when the barrier between Hitler and Germany collapsed, he quickly and rightfully became the idol and hope of the masses in a different guise as a nationalist. Capital and Germany needed it for different and directly opposite purposes. Capital, for a new war that will ultimately elevate America. Germany, for a new life, having thrown off the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles. And here, walking the road of triumph, he followed it to ruin. Why? But because I made a mistake in assessing the second main factor of history, labor. He was mistaken in his rejection of Soviet Russia as a manifestation in his view of Jewish Bolshevism. Although Bolshevism in Russia acquired more and more a national state rather than an international revolutionary hypostasis, and wasn't someone standing nearby, the same Hanfstaengel, carefully watching to ensure that anti-communism did not fade away but flared up, anti-communist Hitler was doomed. While a consistent nationalist Hitler would have been obliged to come to the understanding of the prospects for Germany of only one union with Russia, the anti-communist Hitler opposed such a prospect with all his soul. and a soul, frankly speaking, distorted by the same capital, which did not allow extraordinary figures like Hitler to develop naturally, harmoniously. Those who think about a certain charisma, about the secret occult essence of the Führer, confuse themselves and others. Of course, the real Hitler as a political phenomenon is the product of completely rational and not mystical forces and factors. And there are two main points here. Firstly, it, as has been said, would have been impossible without the industrial and political establishment. This is not a matter of point of view, it is a historical fact. Let's just list the German branch of the mighty global capital. Kardorf, von Scharder, Krupp, von Rentelen, Springorum, Schacht, Schmitz, Mannesmann, Borsig, Duisburg. Looking at the famous group photograph of the captains of German industry, let's continue. Kort, Nage, von Flotow, Tyson, Pielke, Flick, von Karpf, Borbet, Vogler, Pengson. But there were also aristocrats von Papen, von Schleicher, Blomberg, Hindenburg, Ludendorff. Without this elite, without the circle of friends of the Reichsführer SS Himmler, without this background, Hitler simply would not have existed. But there is also a but here. The First World War brought the peoples of only two world powers, Russia and Germany, to the brink of poverty. With a revolutionary breakthrough, Soviet Russia escaped the pressure of world bankers. This Versailles press has been squeezing the last juices out of Germany for more than 10 years. The social situation was heating up among the masses of the people, although not decisively. Both revolutionary sentiments and revolutionary traditions were developed in a very decisive manner. Russia escaped the clutches of capital through its complete overthrow. Germany was hardly capable of such a thing, but it also did not want to tolerate Versailles. It could only break out with a strong national leader. But what kind of political test could it be made of? The Social Democrats of Germany were strong insofar as they were strong under Bismarck. Personally, their leaders of that time were non-entities. The communist man was certainly not without originality, but not enough to change the mood of the masses in favor of the communist choice. Who was left? Either a representative of the traditional elite remained, or the elite tried to put the usual insiders in power. Chancellor von Papen, Chancellor von Schleicher. The first was more primitive, the second, subtler. However, both were not suitable. Who was left? All that remained was a strong nationalist, capable of stabilizing the situation by averaging between labor and capital, and necessarily an energetic anti-Versailles man. Who could compete with Hitler here? Göring is more impressive, more famous, more heroic, and he spoke well. But Fat Herman is just Fat Herman. Stryker, funny. Strasser, not only too red, but also little capable of leadership as such. Rem, it only had enough bullish drive. Germany would not accept this. Who remained? Hitler remained. Yes, if you look at that era with a gaze not distorted by the knowledge of how everything turned out in reality, not clouded by blind rejection, you will see that there was no alternative to Hitler as a national leader capable of rallying the Germans and throwing off the humiliation of Versailles. Man would never have won the elections to the Reichstag, and the Social Democrats would only have muddied the waters for another year or 6 months. Then Germany would still have come not to Nazism, first of all, but to the outstanding nationalist Hitler. In a daily living state, at the helm of daily, concretely defined power are not abstract ideas but concrete people. Political leaders, good or bad, but always specific. So, of all the possible set of them at that time, Hitler was head and shoulders above all the others, even taken together. You can't make one elephant out of 100 rabbits, and therefore, although Hitler was brought to power, he himself strengthened his personal power, making it the basis not of capital, but of mass. Therefore, by the end of the 1930s, he developed into such an individualist leader who could and did leave the imprint of his personality on the country of private owners no less than the collectivist Stalin, who led a country where centralization of management was a natural result of the economic essence, could-do building. Unfortunately, the real Hitler never understood this, but this does not take away from its purely human and political scale. Let us read the lines where the authorship of his personality is indisputable and where it manifests itself clearly and prominently. Let's open Mein Kampf and flip through its pages without any comments. And let's remember that these thoughts do not yet belong to the state leader, but to a 33-year-old aspiring politician who has no real power. I am convinced that, as a rule, I am not talking about cases of exceptional talent. A person should begin to take part in political life no earlier than 30 years of age. In the vast majority of cases, only by this time does a person develop for himself, so to speak, a common platform, from the point of view of which he can determine his attitude to a particular political problem. Only after a person has developed for himself the foundations of such a worldview and has acquired solid ground under his feet can he more or less firmly take a position on topical issues. Only then does this more or less mature person have the right to take part in the political management of society. Otherwise, there is a danger that a person will have to either change his point of view on very significant issues or remain with old views when reason and conviction have long spoken against them. The less he himself now intends to seriously defend his revelations, a person is not inclined to die for what he himself has ceased to believe, the more persistent and, in the end, shameless demands he begins to make to his supporters. Finally, it comes to the point that he loses the last quality of a leader and becomes simply a politician, that is, he joins that class of people whose only principle is unprincipledness, combined with crude obsession and often the art of lying developed to the point of shamelessness. Well, if such a person still continues to be the leader of an entire society, then you can be sure in advance that for him politics has turned into a heroic struggle for the longest possible possession of the shtetl. For this alone, every person with a healthy political instinct will seem to him a personal enemy. In every new movement he sees the possible beginning of his own end. In every larger person there is a threat to his personal existence. First of all, parliamentarism is the reason for the incredible influx of the most insignificant figures that characterize modern political life. It is always a great consolation for a gathering of such representatives of the people to see at their head a person whose mental qualities are on the same level as their own. In fact, look at such a political thief, how he works by the sweat of his brow in order to somehow scrape together a majority and be able to escape from responsibility at any moment. But the less the responsibility of an individual leader becomes, the more the number of such types will grow who, not possessing even the most minimal data, nevertheless feel called upon to put their immortal talents at the disposal of the people. The result of all this is a terrifyingly rapid turnover of people in the most important government positions. Elections are held, and the gentlemen have now been glad for 5 whole years that they got rid of the annoying fuss with the plebs. After 4 years, the gentlemen are overcome by indomitable energy. Just as the larva of the May beetle at a certain moment cannot help but turn into the beetle itself, so they leave the stage of the puppet theater and all, as if on wings, fly to different ends of the country, again to the beloved people. And since it is known that human stupidity is immeasurable, one should not be surprised that the gentlemen, in spite of everything, again achieve their goal. Deceived by the press, blinded by the temptations of the new program, the voting cattle, both of bourgeois and proletarian origin, again return to the stalls of their masters and again give votes to the old deceivers. There is nothing more painful than observing this systematically repeated deception of the masses. What we constantly designate by the words public opinion rests only in a very small part on the results of our own experience and knowledge. For the most part, so-called public opinion is the result of so-called educational work. Political education, which is well described by the word propaganda, falls on the press. In this case, it is like a school for adults. The only trouble is that teaching in this case is not in the hands of the state, but in the hands of often very base forces. Within a few days, the press manages to make the greatest state matter out of some trifle. And vice versa, in the same short period of time, it can literally steal from the memory of the masses such problems that for the masses it would seem are of the greatest vital importance. The deepest interests of the people and the state require preventing the masses from falling into the hands of bad, ignorant and simply dishonest educators. It would be the duty of the state to take control of this education and systematically fight against the abuses of the press. No outcry regarding the so-called freedom of the press should stop the state, which is simply obliged to provide the nation with the healthy mental food it so needs. A healthy state must truly put its stamp on the service of its nation. Aha, the reader will cry out, that's what needed to be proven. This is the way of thinking of the future totalitarian dictator. He is against free thought. Well, my dear reader, I will answer. Here I will have to deviate from my commitment not to comment on Hitler's thoughts and give some explanations. Not only totalitarians treated the so-called freedom of the press with skepticism, but I will call on one compatriot for help. You are welcome, sir. Thank you. So, you were talking about the printed word. Yes, writers in all countries of the world are the smallest class of the entire population. And it is obvious that aristocracy is the most dangerous. There is an aristocracy of people who impose their passions, their prejudices on entire generations. No government can resist the all-destructive effect of the printing projectile. Respect the class of writers, but do not allow it to completely master you. What about free thought? Thought, great word. What constitutes the greatness of a person if not thought? May she be free. Oh. Yes, she will be free, but as a person should be free, within the limits of the law and in full compliance with the conditions imposed by society. But why preliminary censorship? Isn't it redundant? No, laws against the abuse of printing do not prevent evil, but sharply suppress it. One censorship can do both. Well, thank you, Alexander Sergievich, for the conversation. And Pushkin, having bowed, gets into the carriage again to continue that journey from Moscow to St. Petersburg. When these thoughts first came to his mind, well, there is something to think about. After all, Pushkin cannot be classified as either a Nazi or a Stalinist. And now from journey from Moscow to St. Petersburg, let's return to Mein Kampf. It is no coincidence that people coped with the plague more easily than with tuberculosis. The plague manifests itself in a terrible, extremely frightening and repulsive form. Tuberculosis in a much less repulsive but no less dangerous form of a debilitating disease. The plague inspires great horror in a person, while tuberculosis plunges him into gradual indifference. The same can be said regarding the disease of entire folk organisms. If the disease does not take on a catastrophic nature, a person gradually gets used to it and society eventually dies. In such a situation, one has to consider it pure happiness when the process of slow decay is suddenly replaced by a violent manifestation of the disease, so much so that the people are at least aware of how dangerous their situation is. But even in this latter case, in order to begin successful treatment of the disease, it is necessary first of all to correctly understand its source. Our state will proceed from the fact that we do not need physically weak people, even if they are well educated, but we need physically healthy people with a strong character, decisive and energetic. The Greek ideal of beauty remained immortal because here we had an amazing combination of physical beauty with the nobility of the soul and the broad flight of the mind. Our state must take care of physical education not only for the official school period of young people, but also for the post-school period. The state should not abandon its concerns about youth while their period of physical growth continues. It would be completely absurd to imagine the task of the state in such a way that as soon as a young citizen finishes school, the state should suddenly stop caring about him and then remember only when it calls him for military service. No, the state not only has the right, but also the obligation to systematically and steadily take care of the entire physical education of a generation of physically healthy men and women. We attach particular importance to the cultivation of willpower and determination and the systematic cultivation of a sense of responsibility. Our state will instill in young people from school a sense of responsibility and a willingness to courageously defend their opinion. We need this just as we need the systematic education of the will and determination to act in young people. Our entire current, that is in Weimar Germany of the early 1920s SK, social life is a continuous hotbed of sexual temptations and irritations. Just take a closer look at the program of our cinemas, variety shows and theaters, and you cannot deny that this is far from the food that our youth needs. Posters and posters resort to the most base methods of arousing the curiosity of the crowd. It is clear to anyone who has not lost the ability to understand the psychology of youth that all this must cause enormous moral damage to young people. The heavy atmosphere of sensuality that dominates us everywhere inevitably evokes in a boy such ideas that should still be completely alien to him. The results of such education now have to be noted, alas, at every step. Our youth matures too early and therefore ages prematurely. And if we do not tear our youth out of the swamp that surrounds them now, they will inevitably drown in it. We need to free our entire social life from the musty suffocation of modern eroticism. We need to cleanse the atmosphere of all unnatural and dishonest vices. The guiding idea in all this work should be systematic concern for preserving the physical and moral health of our people. What can I add to this, reader? Nothing to me. But the testimony of the American William Shirer, a vocal anti-Nazi, it must be said, who had already observed the results of such views of Hitler, will be useful here. The practice of labor camps (SK), uniting children of all classes and estates, poor and rich, workers and peasants, entrepreneurs and aristocrats who strived for a common goal, which in itself was healthy and useful. Anyone who traveled around Germany in those days, talked with young people, watched them work and have fun in their camps, could not help but notice that there was an unusually active youth movement in the country. The young generation of the Third Reich grew up strong and healthy, full of faith in the future of their country and in themselves, in friendship and camaraderie, capable of crushing all class, economic and social barriers. I thought about this more than once later, in the days of May 1940, when on the road between Aachen and Brussels I met German soldiers, bronzed from the tan, well built and hardened by the fact that in their youth they had spent a lot of time in the sun and eaten well. I compared them with the first English prisoners of war, stooped, pale, with sunken chests and bad teeth, a tragic example of how the rulers of England irresponsibly neglected the youth. But the elite of Germany itself was no less irresponsible towards Germany during Hitler's chancellorship. Instead of actively influencing Hitler, which was quite possible, in the spirit of the absolute primacy of loyalty towards Russia. What kind of loyalty there is, monarchical, bourgeois, communist, this is a matter for Russia itself. The German elite, not all of them, of course, or assented to the Führer, or shrugged her shoulders contemptuously at him. After the real Reich of the real Führer found itself lying in ruins, almost all of his former elite, both new and old, began to talk in unison about the monster. But it is they who look like moral monsters and not Hitler, one of the tragic circumstances of whose fate was that the elite of society did not even try to distance themselves from his affairs that led to the collapse. Conspirators on July 20, 1944. No, and these, while there were successes, served faithfully. The rest cannot boast even of belated resistance. And towering alone among the pitiful crowd of rulers is the figure of Ponter Terek, tall in both physical and moral stature. A Prussian landowner, he was a royal Prussian advisor, a minister of the Weimar Republic, and at one time he was even tipped to become the Reich Chancellor. At Hindenburg's insistence, he was included in Hitler's first cabinet. But the Imperial Commissar of Labor, then 40-year-old Terek, quickly tendered a decisive and demonstrative resignation. He was persecuted but left alone precisely because he went into private life. So who stopped all the holders and spears from doing this? After all, in this case they were not threatened with starvation and cold death. And who can now say how many of those who later condemned him, then, in the late 30s, stood in his way to an honest partnership with the Soviet Union, fueled and nurtured his anti-communism, winked at England behind his back, nodding his head in understanding, Nachasen. After all, they all read chapters of Mein Kampf, entitled Eastern Orientation or Eastern Policy. Just as everyone read Bismarck. When Stalin was informed of Hitler's suicide in 1945, he said one thing. "I finished my game, you scoundrel." What was in this short phrase? Statement. Yes. Regret about something that didn't come true. Maybe. And most likely, too, yes. Chapter 5. Stalin. The essence of the real Stalin was revealed better than in any of his deeds during his lifetime in the first days after his death. The country was crying. What do all the works of the Volkogonovs mean in comparison with this? When Brezhnev died, the country smiled, and she cried for Stalin. Not according to the allocation of regional committees and city committees, but because of heartache. By the way, the real March 5th, the real, not the rational 1953, the greatest theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, said that he had been praying for Stalin for years. In the middle of everyday life, sometimes you come across an inconspicuous person, a small detail, and behind them is a serious essence. Former soldier Ivan Sorokin, who told me this story, comes from the forest areas of the Volga region. His old friend, who served in Stalin's guard, was also from there. Not a children's Arbat NKVD officer, but a frontline sergeant from regimental intelligence, sent at the end of the war through several selection commissions to the disposal of Stalin's security chief, General Vlasic. At the end of his service he often stood at internal posts. He also stood near the dining room at the Kontsevo dacha. I could hear the leisurely conversation at the table and knew when lunch was coming to an end. The compote is drunk, the spoon clinks on the saucer, which means that in a minute Stalin is going out into the corridor. The time for demobilization came, but Vlasic did not let him go home. Like, it's not he who decides, but Comrade Stalin. But he himself gave permission. Ask. And now the soldier is standing at his post, worried, listening intently. Here comes the familiar tinkling sound, and a little later, footsteps. Here Stalin is nearby, and now the soldier has stepped forward. And Stalin, surprised by the unusual act, looks at him a little alarmed, but attentively. Here are the words spoken. Comrade Stalin, my service life has expired, I want to resign. And General Vlasic says that your order is needed. Silence, and then, do you feel bad here? Not bad. Yes, there are sick parents in the village, we need help. And if we send your parents to Moscow, will we help? And the soldier was confused. I didn't prepare any other reasons and was at a loss. And Stalin smiled and asked, what, you haven't come up with anything else? Why lie? Do you want to go home? Home. You should have said so from the start. But there is no need to lie. Well, if that's the case, fine. And he walked down the corridor. What about the soldier? The soldier went home. Human rights activists, however, will cry out, this is tyranny. If I want, I will show the Lord's favor, but the law was not written to him. What are human rights activists to us, reader? They have human rights instead of a heart. But a soldier cannot live without a heart, and Stalin occupied a significant place in him until the end. Not because he let him go home, but because not at that moment, but long before him, the soldier was convinced. This man is strict, but he is kind. True, only for those with whom you can be kind, for those whose conscience is clear. Not before Stalin, but before the motherland. The soldier rarely told about his Stalinist service even to close friends, but more often he simply said, you don't know what kind of person he was. The Arabs seem to say, an apology is worse than a wrongdoing. Yes, it happens that a passionate defense of Stalin is sometimes almost more harmful than the most vile blasphemy against him. Doctor of Historical Sciences Zachary wrote the book Stalin, Truth and Lies. Zachary for Stalin, a mountain. But here he gives data on tanks in Germany and the USSR by June 1941. The Germans have 3,712, we have, they say, 1,800. The conclusion is clear. The Germans had an overwhelming advantage, but Zachary wrote nonsense, and by exposing himself in this way, he undermines the attentive reader's faith in his own rightness in general. Indeed, in reality, the Red Army then had no more than 1,861 kb and T-34, 636 and 1,225 respectively. And these were only the newest cars, such that they hit the main German tanks from 1,500 meters head-on, and they reached the KB and 34 only from 500 meters, and even then to the side or stern. In general, we had approximately, either more or less, 10,000 tanks. Another thing is that our numerous, aging, but not so inferior to most of the Wehrmacht tanks like T-37A, T-38, T-26, BT-5 and 7, T-28 needed medium and major repairs. and they were not exploited in the best way, they were not adapted to the troops in the best way. These tanks helped us a lot at the beginning of the real war of 1941, but we were not able to use them fully. But what does Stalin have to do with it? His job before the war was to create such an industry in Russia so that the Red Army would have these tanks. He did this together with the people, and the fact that the tanks were not used in the best way is the fault of the military. The fault of the Deputy People's Commissar of Defense, Chief of Armaments of the Red Army Tukhachevsky, who mediocrely pursued the policy of state defense orders just when all these T-37A, T-38, T-26, BT-5 and 7, T-28 and others were being developed. The fault of the leadership of the People's Commissariat of Defense, the directorates of the Red Army, and the fault of the commanders of special border military districts. Let's not forget about the guilt of the General Staff of the Red Army and its chiefs. Marshal Igorov, Marshal Shaposhnikov, Boris Mikhailovich was a good theorist, but life required such concepts that would become a guide for practical affairs in building an army, and he could not give them. General Mretskov and Zhukov, who failed to overcome the isolation of the General Staff from the needs of the troops. The famous commander of the 1st Cavalry Army during the Civil War, Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny, is considered by everyone to be an opponent of tanks and a supporter of cavalry. And here is what he said in December 1940 at a meeting of the top leadership of the Red Army. The debate in terms of the use of mobile combat arms, both in tactics and in the operational art of new and already massive combat arms, tanks, aviation and motorized infantry, has always rested on one-sidedness. We reasoned abstractly. Marshal Budyonny was, of course, right. Not Stalin, but the great military theorists throughout the 1930s put forward brilliant general doctrines but constantly got confused in the rare forest of 3 pines of a specific matter. But Budyonny, on the contrary, defended the tanks very consistently and very specifically, stating, "The operational idea of using tanks was nested in the army at one time in such a way that tanks could operate on an operational scale without any support from cavalry, motorized infantry and infantry in general. Then they came again to a different conclusion, that tanks cannot act independently. And then Kazan followed, unsuccessful battles near the far eastern Lake Kazan with the Japanese. We suffered unnecessary losses in the tanks there, and therefore some concluded that tanks have now outlived their usefulness. Tanks, of course, cannot operate successfully in the mountains. In the Finnish theater there, by the way, the future chief of the General Staff Mretskov caught not so much Finnish cuckoo snipers as crows. Tanks were also used unsuccessfully, not knowing the conditions of the theater. After this, voices are heard again that the tanks did not live up to expectations. It would be wrong to take such a sweeping approach to assessing the types of troops and their use. The solution now to issues related to the organization of an offensive operation, the use of tank formations plays an extremely huge role for our army. This is how the cavalry marshal assessed the value of tanks, and the theorists shied away either towards them or, as we see, away from them. Could Stalin then find time to also understand what the professionals of military science should have understood? Stalin was not a god. The jacket on his back had no slits for wings, even angelic ones. Let us return once again to Zachary's book, where he writes about the fakes of anti-Stalinists describing the horrors of the monstrous famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s. But there was hunger, scary. The one in which my grandmother miraculously survived with her 3 young daughters, among whom was my mother. None of them blamed Stalin later. The famine came after a severe drought, and it was aggravated by the ancestors of the current foreman of Perestroika. Here is a description from Nature of the situation in Dnepropetrovsk in 1935, made by one of the participants in the All-Union Physico-Chemical Conference, later the greatest Soviet physicist, Sergei. The solemn general meeting, at which the secretary of the regional party committee Katayevich spoke, made an unpleasant impression. He was a Jew, short, broad-shouldered, with very rough features. The local authorities of a lower rank surrounded him with an obsequious and servile air. Everyone stood up and began to applaud. Someone shouted, "Our great Katayevich! Hooray!" The scene looked completely cartoonish. A year or two later I read in the newspaper that he had been shot. Yes, in the early 1930s, these Katayevichs felt like masters of Ukrainian cities and were cruel to the Ukrainian village due to their eternal callousness, soullessness and contempt for the grain grower. Stalin, if he was cruel and not cruel, was due to severe historical necessity. On January 15, 1928, his train set off for Siberia for 3 weeks. Novosibirsk, Barnaul, Rubtsovsk, Omsk. Conversations revealed a gloomy picture. The agricultural problem was reaching a dead end. In 1926-27, the USSR exported 2,178,000 tons of grain, and a year later, only 344,000 and 248,000 even had to be imported. The reason was not crop failure, but that the village did not want to give away grain cheaply. The kulaks simply sabotaged supplies and waited for market prices to triple. It was more profitable to speculate in bread. Just 15 years ago, the average resident of the Russian Empire consumed 1 teaspoon of sugar per day. 1 tea room reader. The peasant did not see sugar at all, neither on the table nor in life. In the report to the Fifth Congress of Authorized United Noble Societies in 1909, its author V. Garko wrote, "The export of grain occurs not from wealth but from need at the expense of the population's nutrition. Our people, as you know, are forced vegetarians, that is, they almost never see meat." The Soviet government gave the peasant land and food in the second half of the 1920s when pre-revolutionary grain production was restored, for 5 times less grain was exported than before. As a legacy from centuries of Tsarism, the village has a horizon no further than a sparrow's nose. The first third of the 20th century was ending, and the psychology of the peasant was not far from the 18th century. In the conditions of those years, such a gap between the consciousness of the peasant masses and the reality of state life threatened not with backwardness but with the death of the country. She simply would not be able to develop or defend herself. Under the Tsar, a lot of grain was exported from the hungry belly of the peasant and not from large-scale production. When the First World War began, this weakness of Russian agriculture became evident very quickly. And not the Bolsheviks but the Tsarist government on November 29, 1916 first introduced the concept of forced surplus appropriation by issuing a decree on the allocation of grain and fodder. All this was quite definitely shown by Professor Kondratiev in his book The Bread Market and its Regulation During War and Revolution. In 1922, it was published in an edition of 2,000 copies, and one of them was in Lenin's personal Kremlin library. The second edition of 1991 also cannot be called widespread, 4,000 copies. And from this work it is clear that the Tsar's grain exports were based on the peasants' malnutrition, without any benefit for the latter, but with great benefit for the former. There would be no patches on Ivan's backside, and the mistress of the Tsar and the Grand Dukes, the ballerina Malika Kshasinskaya, would have neither a palace nor diamond sets. By the way, the old autocratic Tsarist Russia, even if it had survived or even if it had managed to transform into a constitutional monarchy or a bourgeois republic after the victorious First World War, would only have added to these patches on the peasants' backsides. By the end of 1917, the state debts of Tsarist Russia amounted to 64 billion gold rubles, more than 50% of the national wealth. External debts amounted to 16 billion, and 9 of them were short-term debts. Russia would probably be mortgaged to foreign banks, wrote the American B. Hopper already in the 1930s. Soviet Russia could not be mortgaged to any bank. It did not recognize the Tsar's debts, but this did not make her richer. The country was already undermined by the foreign policy of Tsarism, which tied Russia to an unnecessary war with Germany and thereby weakened the power. Now, at the end of the 1920s, it was even necessary to go to extremes, to a breaking point, to patches, so that in return the peasant would have his own tractor, Russian, calico, and his own planes and tanks. Did the village understand the need for this? No. What was left? But only what Stalin proposed and did. Stalin is collectivization, but the Katayevichs are its excesses. But let's be fair, the eternal darkness of the peasant masses turned out to be even more dangerous than the Katayevichs. In 1929, the year of the great turning point, there were, by the way, all information taken from the mass reference calendar for 1941, almost 35 million horses in the country, and in 1932 there were only 20. The number of sheep and goats decreased by 2/3, the number of pigs decreased by half, and the number of cows decreased by 1/3. But it was not Stalin who cut them, but a man, confused by Kulak propaganda, the local arrogance of the overbenders and his own scantiness. If I don't eat it, I'll bite it. Think about it, reader. Tens of millions of cattle slaughtered overnight, that is essentially ruined heads of cattle. This is the price of the stubborn individuality of the middle peasant and the class resistance of the kulak. And here are some more numbers. Private but scary. For several years, a gang of 35 people operated in the village of Noviki, Ryazan district. 38 thefts, 28 arson, 13 murders, 11 beatings, 3 armed raids. In addition, wrote Evening Moscow on November 17, 1928, bandits pursued and beat Komsomol members, driving the cell underground. The frightened population remained silent. Alas, the peasant grayness and kulak anger also had a higher human price. 250,000 kulak and middle peasant families went into exile. This is no small thing, because this is a tragedy for 1.5 million people. But this is not much if you know that the future of the remaining 99 was paid for with the brittleness of 1%. Among the memoirs of contemporaries of those events, one can find very revealing evidence. A descendant of the ancient princely family of Gedimenovich, Sergei Golitsyn, remained with his family in Russia after the revolution as a boy, died in 1989 and left notes of a survivor. Throughout his long life, Golitsyn never understood the essence of what was happening to his motherland. He did not want to understand it, and therefore he judged the era as a layman. But it is precisely the sincere spontaneity of perception that makes his lines valuable. He also wrote, "For the peasantry, the most terrible times were the last 3 months of 1929 and the first 3 months of 1930, when, as if under the blows of axes, the centuries-old foundations, customs, and habits of the village residents collapsed." Brother Vladimir expressed the idea of a group of sadists who seized power and brought the country to such a state that it seemed as if it had fallen into an abyss, and there are no such forces to hold her. But Golitsyn also admits that the mass destruction of livestock by the peasants themselves began. So, in the perception of the Russian nobles, the Princess Golitsyn, who for centuries sat on the peasants' necks, the Bolsheviks are a group of sadists. Their course leads into the abyss. But the German nobleman, General Friedrich von Mellenthin, later assessed that era based on its results differently. Almost all the commissars are residents of cities and come from the working class. Their courage borders on recklessness. These people are very smart and determined. They managed to create in the Russian army what it lacked in the First World War: iron discipline. Discipline is the main trump card of communism. It was a decisive factor in achieving Stalin's enormous political and military successes. The industrialization of the Soviet Union, carried out persistently and mercilessly, provided new technology and a large number of highly qualified specialists. The skillful and persistent work of the communists has led to the fact that since 1917 Russia has changed in the most amazing way. There can be no doubt that the Russian is increasingly developing the skill of independent action, and the level of his education is constantly growing. The Golitsyns perceived what was happening as death, but they are already refuted by the statistics of the rapid growth of gross grain harvests with fewer people employed in the countryside. However, reader, we should now be more interested in the psychological side of the matter, and therefore let us return to the surviving Golitsyn. In 1929, he lived in Moscow and had fun with his peers at foxtrot parties. A young, healthy, fairly educated guy. He was arrested but soon released, and before that, the investigator, with sincere, according to Golitsyn himself, sympathy, told him, "I want to give you advice on my own behalf. Now large-scale construction has begun throughout the country. and you dance foxtrots. You should join the nationwide creative process. My advice to you, leave Moscow for one of the construction sites. With hard work you will prove your commitment to Soviet power. Golitsyn did not want to leave Moscow and he began to make excuses. But they won't accept me, I'm deprived, and even with such a social background, your voting rights will be restored, the investigator answered with conviction. But how could such honest advice reach Gediminovich's soul if he and his friends at those foxtrot parties in 1929 amused themselves with solving such objective charades? They piled a tower of chairs up to the ceiling and then it collapsed. Everyone guessed the plan. This is socialism being built. This is how the former were abused. But the rebuilt, Sovietized old and new semi-intellectuals were not far from them. Among Yevgeny Petrov's manuscripts there is a plan for the book My Friend Ilf. And there is a very accurate, as I understand it, description of the ideological atmosphere in which the creative intelligentsia of Moscow existed in 1926. Petrov wrote, Red Army. The only person who sent me a letter was Ilf. In general, the style of that time was like this. Don't give a damn about everything. It's stupid to write letters. The Moscow Art Theater is a mediocre theater. Read Giulio Giuranito, a somewhat phantasmagoric novel in style by Ilya Ehrenberg. S.K. Passion for Cinema. Mary Pickford. Films with chases. The first foxtrots. At the same time, they lived in poverty. It was not young foxtrotists but young engineers who could provide the country with a rich life. But Moscow, which was engrossed in Giulio Giuranito, looked down on these latter ones as narrow-minded, second-class creatures with primitive demands. Of course, boring theoretical mechanics, strength of materials, thermodynamics, no exotics, no chases. True, these engineers have some kind of Pickford cord or Bickfords, but Mary Pickford clearly doesn't use it and you can't decorate a new suit with it. In Moscow there was already an overabundance of cannibal eloquence with a vocabulary of not 30 words but 30,000, and not even in one language. And despite all the difference in education, the kinship of natures was almost complete here. They break not their destinies but the psychology and arrogance of the princes of the ancient family, disastrous for the country, and the dullness of their former stinkers. It was broken, and Russia received a large industry, a reliable base of commercial grain, and a new village. In the 1920s, a man, with God's help and rain, could sometimes produce a record harvest better than the collective farm harvest of the mid-1930s. But only the collective farmer ensured a sustainable increase in production. 10 years after the turning point of 1929, Soviet Russia already had such agriculture and agricultural engineering that its people were no longer threatened with mortal famine in any weather. For the first time in the history of Russia, and only the collective farm and the Soviet government, in a matter of years, cleaned out the centuries-old manure of darkness from the village and brought peasant youth out into the open spaces of the 20th century. In 1917, 16-year-old Ivan Chistyakov, the future Colonel General, hero of the Soviet Union, came to St. Petersburg from the Dvor village of Otrubnevo to help his uncle clear the courtyard of House 33 on Voznesensky Prospect. And 10 years later, the young painter was already studying Shaposhnikov's book The Brain of the Army. At that time, a career military man could not get married without the permission of the regiment commander. Chistyakov's comrade Lobachev received such permission without any problems. His pretty chosen one Tanya was from a poor peasant woman. The three friends went to the registry office where a smiling woman handed the marriage registration book first to the groom. Sign it. Lobachev painted a dashing flourish and extended his hand to the bride. Hold it, Tanyasha. And she just remained silent and blushed. Sign, citizen. The employee hurried impatiently and Tanya burst into tears. I'm illiterate. That day, the bride put 3 crosses not only on paper but also on her entire past life. At the end of the 1930s, Chistyakov again met with old friends the Lobachevs. Tanya, he recalled, by that time already had a higher education, graduated from the history department of the university. There was no trace of anything like this in Trotsky's plans. And this, reader, is not an opinion but a fact. Trotsky himself assured him, declaring in the Western press, "The opposition has never undertaken to catch up and overtake the capitalist world in the shortest possible time. We thought of the socialist reorganization of peasant farms only in the perspective of decades. This can only be done within the framework of an international revolution. We never demanded the elimination of classes within the framework of the Stalin-Krzyzhanovsky 5-year plan." Kraskom Chistyakov followed Stalin and became a Soviet general. The peasant woman Tanya followed him and became a historian. But someone the same age as them, like Barman, followed Trotsky. And he ended up turning from a graduate of a military academy, intelligence officer and diplomat into a defector and very soon into an open agent of the US intelligence services. Another of their younger contemporary, Prince Golitsyn, chose the position of an outside observer, arrogantly looking at how his people were eliminating the consequences of the domination of Golitsyn's ancestors. A seemingly purebred Russian, at a turning point in the history of the motherland, he turned out to be spiritually alien to it. Until his death, he saw the era through its adversities and did not accept its achievements. But he also had to work on 5-year construction projects, go through the war as an engineer surveyor, receive orders and medals, write good books for children. In Tsarist Russia, Golitsyn would have lived a happy life, a slacker or semi-idler. In Stalin's Russia, he had to become a worker, albeit reluctantly. And this also reflected the strength and rightness of Stalin as the people's leader and builder of the state. And that's why it doesn't need embellishment. It is justified by accurate historical facts extracted not from storage funds that are dubious in today's false archival times but from the visible affairs of the Stalin era. Truth of fact and logic. This is enough for Stalin to appear before us as he really was, the greatest creator at the head of millions of creators, the most powerful patriot among millions of young Soviet patriots. Back in the late 20s, Stalin's enemies began to accuse him of suppressing dissent. And indeed, in the country such freedom of thought was very harshly suppressed, which did not distinguish between violence in the interests of capital and violence in the interests of labor. Thinking differently in Stalin's Soviet Union was a dangerous undertaking. But this did not mean that the desire to think broadly and originally was not allowed or encouraged. And this was precisely Stalin's style. He did not forgive superficiality and dishonesty, but was always ready to respect true originality. A good example here is his initiative towards Mikhail Bulgakov. In a difficult moment for the writer, Stalin called Bulgakov himself and then helped him as best he could. But Bulgakov was persecuted by precisely those Moscow intellectuals who recognized the only type of diversity, the petty opinions of their own circle. Among Bulgakov's persecutors was Fyodor Raskolnikov, the future defector ambassador and author of the open letter to Stalin, and in 1929, the commandingly condescending, the expression of Bulgakov's wife, chairman of the Arts and Political Council under the General Repertoire Committee, who claimed, according to the testimony of Elena again, Sergievna Bulgakova, to the laurels of Shakespeare, Molière and Sophocles with Ripids combined. Intellectually and spiritually, this layer in which the Raskolnikovs flourished was most often a literary offshoot of Trotskyism, but nationally. Here are the critics of the literary magazine Krasnaya November, famous in the 1920s. Lelevich, Averbach, Volin, Gelfand, Grossman, Rothschan, Gerstein, Sergievskaya, Matze, Nels, Pickle, Nyhamks, Stetsky, Osip Betsky, Polyak, Gurvich, Brainina, Tager, Charny, Ramblek, Hoffenschiffer. Ezra, Gelfand, Nusinov, Kogan, Matz, Hanbaum, Wacht. Dinik worked in the magazines Print and Revolution and Literature and Marxism. The editors of the Young Guard were Averbach and Kershen. In the magazine on post, the poems of the critics G. Tumbleweed, G. Kalmanson and Herbstman were reviewed. There could also appear an article about Gorky with the title Former Glavsicle, Noutsenters or lines like this. The battle is merciless, there is no shortage of cartridges and prisoners are unnecessary. and there a certain Sverdlova wrote, bookstore counters helpfully offer preschoolers a book thoroughly saturated with an ideology alien to the proletariat. This is about the Circus and Miracles by Marshak and Marcus book with Moidodier by Chukovsky. At the Literary Post, in another magazine of Marxist criticism, stood Auerbach, Volin, Leibedinsky and the lordly Raskolnikov, and literary analyses were written by critics Hal Perina, Isbach, Levin, Messer, Polyak, Serebryansky, Mashbits, Verov, Kogan, Zaprovskaya, Kor. But the magazines Rap and Literature and Art, Raltsevich, Gerstein, Krenman, Aptekar, Usevich, Bachakar, Zyvelchinskaya, Messer, Altman, Nusinov, Shupik. The Ogonyok magazine was started by Mikhail Koltsov Friedli and another Friedli and a photographer Sheikh. Already in 1928, a certain Gabor gave an essay from Berlin in the magazine Proshector with the title In the Enemy Camp, and in a similar spirit, Just Kushner Alski wrote about Germany. Reader, you are undoubtedly tired, but how tired many were in those years of this mosquito fuzz around the life and literature created by the talent of Yesenin, Mayakovsky, Sholokhov, Twardowski, Tikhonov, Pasternak, Bulgakov, Fedin, Tolstoy, Gaidar, Ilf and Petrov, Sobolev, Herman. Among the 582 delegates of the First All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers there were 201 Russians, 25 Ukrainians, 17 Belarusians, Jews 113, and the Moscow delegation looked like anything at all. Out of 175 delegates there were 91 Great Russians, 1 Belarusians, 1 Ukrainians, 57 Jews. Belarusian Francisc Skorina and Great Russian Ivan Fedorov clearly missed the mark when they were doing the first printing in Russian. It would be more correct to immediately master Yiddish, for by the 30s of the 20th century, the nation of Pushkin and Shevchenko statistically gave way to the Soviet literary heirs of Shalom Aleikum dozens of times. This is who created the atmosphere of intolerance and parochialism, petty group fuss and group factional connivance with our own people. This is the layer that fluttered around the matter but did not do it. In the late 20s and early 30s, this was the case not only in literature but also in politics. They persecuted not only Bulgakov but also Stalin. The People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Chicherin, who had fallen ill in 1929, had already retired from business, or rather, he was pushed out of it, despite the fact that Stalin believed that Chicherin should be left behind, even if he worked for 2 hours. On March 22, Chicherin writes to Stalin from abroad, "When I write to you now, I remember Reisman, member of the Presidium of the Central Control Commission since 1924, S.K. Litvinov, Chicherin's future successor Mir Wallach, S.K. Mif, Comintern figure fortis, S.K. My pain immediately worsens. If instead of good workers they impose on us the students of Lomanads, Shatskin, Semenov, head of the Pravda Publishing House, S.K. I can only be 1,000 miles away." And this entire last list refers to the young guard of Trotskyism. Chicherin, let me remind you, expressed himself in 1927 like this. Why is this being done? Prostituted narcomindal, hooliganized Comintern. The Zinovievites are in charge. This is a look at the situation from the inside through the eyes of a knowledgeable person. It was not Stalin, but Trotsky, Zinoviev and their ardent supporters who made normal working discussions about how best to build the country and not plunge it into external and internal adventures impossible. It was not the thirst for power, not intolerance, but the legitimate feeling of a man busy with practical work that forced Stalin to write to Molotov in July 1929. The articles of Stan and Shatskin are either the stupidity of the editors of Komsomolskaya Pravda or a direct challenge to the Central Committee of the party. To call the subordination of Komsomol members and therefore party members to the general line of the party servicism means to call for a revision of the general line of the party, for the loosening of iron discipline, for the transformation of the party into a debating club. This is where Trotsky began his work. Zinoviev danced from the same stove, but Bukharin chose the same path for himself. The Shatskin Auerbachs and Lamenads group also takes this path. It's time to call to order this group, which is straying onto the path of petty bourgeois, Trotskyist radicalism, since only in this way will it be possible to straighten out these young comrades and preserve them for the party. And here is a letter to Molotov, who was on vacation, dated December 5, 1929. Hello Molotstein. Why the hell did you climb into a den like a bear and remain silent? Things are going well for us so far. Today we decided to increase the emergency food fund to 120 million poods. We are raising supply standards in industrial cities like Ivano-Voznetsk, Kharkov, etc. You should already be aware of our foreign affairs. Things should go well with China. Apparently, our guys from the Far East scared them a lot. We are talking about the conflict on the Chinese Eastern Railway, SK. We just received a telegram from Chang Zuliang. America and England and France, with their attempt at intervention, were shaved off rather roughly. We couldn't do otherwise. Let them know, the Bolsheviks. I think the Chinese landowners will also not forget our object lessons. A person's writing is his style, it is the person himself. And it is clear that the person who knew how to write such letters is a good, spiritually healthy, energetic, but very busy person. 3 weeks later he writes to Molotov like this. Hello Vyacheslav, I know that in your heart you scold me for my silence. It cannot be denied that you have every right to do this. But put yourself in my position. I'm incredibly overworked. I have no time to sleep, literally. And there is no time to stand on ceremony if, due to the depreciation of paper money, smart businessmen begin to buy silver coins, speculate on them and hide them. Pyatakov proposes to import additional silver from England, but Stalin recommends a different method. Test punch. Reader, I am not afraid to tell you these words of Stalin, because applying such a method to those who walk with cheerful feet, in the words of our great surgeon and teacher Pragov, in times of people's difficulties is the highest humanism of a true people's political leader. After all, a worker simply does not have the opportunity to buy and hide. He constantly spends money on life, is not it? Stalin at the 16th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, said, "We are 5100 years behind the advanced powers. We must run this distance in 10 years or we will be crushed." The SV Congress is 1930. This is the Congress of the full-scale offensive of socialism along the entire front. Let's do the math. 1930 minus 100 years is 1830. That is the first third of the 19th century. Almost the Napoleonic era. Maybe Stalin went overboard here, and perhaps not, given that even in not very industrialized Austria there were more industrial workers in the 40s of the 19th century than in the Russian Empire in its peak year of 1913. At the beginning of the 20th century, spending on public education per capita in Russia was 12 times less than in England. The length of railways per capita was almost 15 times less than in the USA. Moreover, Russian railways, unlike European ones, were entirely single track, and half of the steam locomotives were almost the younger brothers of the Cherepanov brothers steam locomotive. 2 of the 3 were built before 1880. Already familiar to us, Garko reported to the representatives of the United Noble Societies. All countries, without exception, are several dozen times ahead of us. The annual productivity of one resident in Russia in 1904 was only 58 rubles, while in the United States it reached 346 rubles 15 years earlier. An intelligent, although often limited, researcher of Soviet science, Professor Lauren Graham from the United States, wrote, "The revolutions of 1917 took place in a country that was in a critical situation. In general, the Soviet Union was a backward and underdeveloped country for which a speedy solution to basic economic problems was vital. As is often the case in underdeveloped countries which still have a small layer of highly educated specialists, the previous scientific tradition in Russia was predominantly theoretical in nature." Graham hit the nail on the head here, as they say. In 1913, Russian universities graduated 2,624 lawyers, 236 clergy and only 65 communications engineers, 208 communications engineers, 166 mining engineers and 100 builders and architects. Like this, for 236 scientific priests, there are 208 track engineers, and this is a total of both railway workers and watermen. And even factory production engineers increased by only 1,277 people that year. Among the corresponding members of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in the category of physical sciences, that is, practical sciences that determined the level of development of the country in general, for every 10 domestic ones there were 38 foreign ones. But in the category of historical and philological sciences, ours prevailed, 16 to 14. These are the Russian figures in addition to the Americans' opinion. However, Graham revealed the abilities of not only a scientist but also a card sharper when he stated that such a feature of Soviet science as the unusually large role of the central government was inherited by the Soviet government from its Tsarist predecessor. No, the Tsarist administration treated the needs of domestic science with more than restraint. In the first years of Soviet power, attention to science was rather inwards because there were not enough funds for more. In the 1920s, although science in the USSR was in a better position than in Tsarist times, there was still no strength for its serious development. However, here is evidence of a major Soviet optician, a descendant of the Russified Swedes, Sergei, by the way, the son and grandson of senators who were never disadvantaged and the great-nephew of the chairman of the State Council of the Russian Empire. His teacher Bakayev immediately after the revolution grumbled, "Our commissars are yesterday's semi-literate workers. They think that every scientist of ours, if he is one of the former, will spread to the bourgeoisie. No, we will never be allowed abroad. We are doomed to be completely separated from world science." But already from the beginning of the 1920s they began to send people on long scientific trips abroad. The example of Rutherford's favorite Piotr Kapitsa is only the most famous but not the only one. Let me remind you that in the 20s, Yuli Borisovich Karitin, the future scientific director of the first Soviet nuclear weapons development center in Arzamas 16, also worked for Rutherford in Cambridge. And here is what Frisch writes. In the second half of the 20s, Soviet physics quickly advanced and gained worldwide recognition in many directions. These successes were caused not only by the emergence of a large number of generously funded institutes but also by the wide communication of Soviet scientists with all of world science. Frisch already assesses the 20s as rapid growth, but in fact, a qualitative leap occurred precisely in those years that the Golitsyn brothers perceived as the death of Russia. If in 1929 there were 438 scientific research institutes and their branches, then by the end of 1932 there were already 1028. But this was only a running start. In 1929, the country had 20,000 scientists and 10 years later almost 100,000. Back in 1928, the father of Soviet physicists Abram Fedorovich Ioffe, who enjoyed great authority from Stalin, organized the first All-Union Congress of Physicists. Many foreigners also came to Moscow, among whom Dirac, Brillouin, Born and Debichon. After a week of Moscow meetings, the Congress moved by rail to Gorky, and from there on a specially chartered ship to Stalingrad. Meetings continued on the ship and in the large university cities of Kazan and Saratov. From Stalingrad we moved by train to Orjhonikidze and from there by car to Tbilisi. There the Congress officially closed, but the majority still went to the seaside, to Batumi, and from there they began to go home. And 11.5 years before that, in January 1917, Professor Bogdanovich, at a meeting of the Commission for the Study of the Productive Forces of Russia, created at the Imperial Academy of Sciences through the efforts of academician Vernadsky, made a report on tungsten deposits in Turkestan and Altai. There was a war going on. Tungsten is a high-speed steel and therefore has the ability to release shrapnel twice as much. Bogdanovich ended with the message. So, gentlemen, 500 rubles are needed to study Turkestan wars. What about our request to the government? Asked Professor Fursman. Recently we received another answer. There is no money in the treasury. Actually, gentlemen, as you know, the government has been refusing us for 2 years now. Reader. Bogdanovich did not misspeak, and there is no typo here. Tsarism did not have 500 rubles for the expedition. And according to the state budget for 1913, the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, received 16 million for the needs of the Ministry of the Imperial Household and another 4,286,895 rubles for use known to His Imperial Majesty. And this does not include his income from personal lands and other things. And this is only the Tsar, but there was also a pack of Grand Dukes and other idlers from the August family. Bogdanovich glinted sadly with his glasses, and then academician Kremlev, mathematician and shipbuilder, stood up. In a tone that was both firm and irritated, he said, "As for Turkestan, everything is simple. Here are 500 rubles to save an army dying from lack of shells." And Altai. Fursman did not let up. "It's more difficult with Altai." Kremlev thought for a moment, then answered. Karl Ivanovich did not indicate that the mines are located on the lands of the Grand Dukes Vladimirovich. And suddenly he exploded. "What the hell is this? The royal family also took over the tungsten deposits of Transbaikalia. This is where requisition or expropriation is appropriate." Silence awkwardly squeezed into the commission meeting, but they immediately moved on, however, to another issue. About 500 rubles was entered into the protocol, but about the dynasty. After this, the American Graham was free to blame Stalin for the insane pace of industrialization and collectivization. The rates were determined by simple calculation. Here is 1929 with its plough, the peasantry at the level of the last century, and science, which has already moved away from its former restlessness under the Tsar, but has not yet become a major productive force. And over there, the year is 1939. The year, according to sober assessments, is leading the world into an era of new serious military confrontation. The difference is only 10 years. During this period, it was necessary to go from a plough to a T-34 tank, an IL to attack aircraft and rocket artillery, better known as Katyushas. And it was also necessary to go from the hem of a shirt instead of a handkerchief to the mass ownership of this equipment, to hundreds of thousands of pilots, tank crews, aircraft mechanics, and radio operators. So the scrupulous researcher of the history of Soviet science, Graham, wrote nonsense. The pace was set wisely, but at such a pace the tasks had to be solved at an insanely complex rate. But we have to. And one can only be surprised at how keenly Stalin, with his only theological seminary, past as a militant, professional exile and exile runner, understood the need for powerful science for the country. I didn't understand it at all, but I understood it practically, right now. After all, scientific centers of the entire spectrum of knowledge began to grow in the USSR not on their own, but according to the resolutions of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. The same academician Kremlev said, "One must think with knowledge of the matter." Russian science in the past did not enjoy the respect of the Tsarist government. At that time, a single scientist worked mainly for his own science. Now the scientist works for the people. He solves the problems of gigantic construction. He creates new industry, new technology. For the first time in our country, a scientist became a truly statesman. But who needed such statesmen? Trotsky, Zinoviev. They needed figures of a new revolution, at least on a European scale. What about science? In the early 1920s in Petrograd, where Zinoviev set the tone, according to the memoirs of Sergei Frisch, in the academic part of the university, all affairs were managed by certain Motselevich and Leifert, both big careerists and people of little integrity. It remains to add, both are Trotskyists, And it was not through the efforts of the Trotskyists that those resolutions of the Central Committee were prepared that gave rise to academic institutes, energy, geological, paleontological, zoological, chemical physics, botanical, genetics, geography, plant physiology, physical, general and inorganic chemistry, physical problems, organic chemistry, mathematical, microbiology, fossil fuels, biochemistry, colloid electrochemical, evolutionary morphology and paleozoology. These are only new institutes, only the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, only for 5 years, from 1930 to 1934. And behind this brilliant list was precisely Stalin's view of what the country should be doing, discussions about the structure of the party or work under party leadership. Piotr Kapitsa stayed in Cambridge with Rutherford for 13 years. In 1934, they hinted to him from home, "It's time to be honored. Let's give Kapitsa his due." He returned to the USSR and immediately became a major figure in theoretical and applied physics, director of the Institute of Physical Problems of the Academy of Sciences. This is how he wrote to Stalin and Molotov about the problems with the material base of the institute. "What kind of government are you if you cannot force it to be built? Tyrants do not forgive such irascibility." But Stalin did not object to such criticism, because behind it was not the petty pride of a poser, not the grumbling of an envious person, and not the gloating of a hidden enemy, but a businesslike desire to see new laboratories, installations, and workshops built as quickly as possible. The desire to make new science for a new power. And for the same purpose, Stalin knew how to see the difference between, say, Lev Davidovich Trotsky and Lev Davidovich Landau. The first one showed figurines to Stalin, and the outside world saw figurines towards the USSR, and it was unforgivable. The second one kept Stalin and Soviet power in his pocket. However, at the same time, in Kharkov at the Ukrainian Institute of Physics and Technology, founded in 1928, he was busy, albeit of a special kind, but also with construction of new knowledge, and this was enough for Landau, who was hostile to socialism, to continue working. In 1932, a telegram from UPT director Abramov left Kharkov addressed to Stalin, Molotov and Zhanikids. On October 10, UPT researchers were the first in the USSR and the second in the world to destroy a lithium nucleus by bombarding it with hydrogen nuclei accelerated in a discharge tube. Yes, we were second, but after whom? In the same 1932, the country of Newton, Maxwell, Faraday, Kelvin, and Rutherford was the first to build a proton accelerator. In England, they have long been able to appreciate the work of a scientist. However, neither the Anglo-Saxons Churchill and Roosevelt, nor even more so, a series of French and German parliamentary politicians came in any comparison with Stalin in the consciousness of the prospects of scientific knowledge and its future place in the progress of society. A political leader, he had here the precision of a scientific organizer, combined with the calculation of a smart industrial tycoon, who knows that investments in science will always pay off with interest. The Gedimenovich Golitsins built pyramids from chairs at this time. Trotsky made plans to overthrow Stalin. Stalin's USSR was simply built. It was not for nothing that Gorky created a magazine called USSR at Construction, where the editorial article of the first issue stated, "In order to deprive our enemies inside and outside the Soviet Union of the opportunity to distort and discredit the readings of words and numbers, we decided to turn to the work of the sun, to photography. The sun cannot be accused of distortion. The sun illuminates what is the way it is." So much was said later that Stalin allegedly eradicated the spirit of freedom. Let's try to look at this established myth from an unusual side. Any specialist in child psychology will tell you that the foundations of personality are laid by the age of 5 or 6. Popular wisdom also does not disagree with science. Educate while it lies across the bench. Lay down along it and you won't be able to straighten it out. Well, that's right. And in any case, by the age of 20, a person is basically molded. Isn't that right, reader? And if so, let's take up thesis number 2. The famous 60s, who themselves called themselves children of Khrushchev's thaw, became a symbol of inquisitiveness, unacceptable compromise, a symbol of treating the world as a home, where the main thing is the feeling of being the master of life. Set the table on Vastonia Square. This is a poetic order for a specific composition of companions. Voznensky, Rozdestvensky, Yevtushenko, Akhmedulina. But the 60s are not a group or even a layer. This is truly a generation. Generation of the Moscow Festival, songs of Vizbar and Pakhyatova. The generation of the Gagarin Spring, the Bratsk hydroelectric power station, the young poems of the same Yevtushenko, Voznensky, Rozdestvensky, the films of Kutsev, Muratova, Shepitko, the fiction of the Strugotskys and Ivan Yefimov. In the early 60s, this generation was about 30 years old. This means that he was born around the year 1930 or 1933. That is, if we believe Stalin's false commentators, the foundations of the personality of these future uninhibited bearers of the new consciousness were laid under the groans of the prisoners of the Gulag, the heard roar of the crowd welcoming the Moscow trials, and the creaking boots of the NKVD executioners who were arresting people without exception, entire neighborhoods. Moreover, by the day of the death of the real Stalin, that is by March 5, 1953, these were already 20-year-old boys and girls whose entire lives from their first cry to their first kiss passed exclusively in the Stalin era. So where, one might ask, do they have unconventional thinking and relaxed feelings? And weren't they actually shaped by the energy of new songs? Weren't they sung from kindergarten? We have no barriers on sea or land. We were born to make a fairy tale come true. You proudly and boldly go for a just cause without fear of anything. Whoever is used to fighting for victory, let him sing with us. This generation of future 60s was one of the first to learn baggage, who to be abstracted from Basne Street, Uncle Stopper and Cockroach, Mr. Twister and Moidodier. He was one of the first to read books by Bianchi, Bazhov, Cassil, Freerman, Gaidar, Zhitkov. It was for him that the brilliant masters of book graphics Lebedev, Safonov, Konashevich worked. Academicians Abrachev and Fersman wrote for them. It was their still unintelligent but malleable mind that listened to the reports of Chkalov, Gromov, Papanin, Kokinoki. It was they who caught with their burning eyes the shine of the first stars of heroes of labor and heroes of the Union. No, the freedom of behavior of these 30-year-olds in the real 60s is not the result of the rotten Khrushchev thaw, but the result of the Stalinist Russian cold of the 30s, which froze out the evil spirits and tempered the young soul for an intelligent, active life. Russian cold is good for my health. This is Pushkin, who fell from Dant's bullet in 1837. Pushkin, Russian joy. Therefore, it is not surprising that in 1937, a cold year for Russia's enemies, the country celebrated the centenary of the poet's memory as a state event. No, everything healthy in the young 60s comes from the era of the Bolshevik Stalin. And the rot that later took hold of their souls came from the late years of the undiscovered Trotskyist Khrushchev. I leaf through a tattered book, N. Verzilin, in the footsteps of Robinson, Leningrad branch of Dudge's, 2nd edition, corrected and expanded, 1953, the year of the death of the real Stalin. By this year, the new person's worldview has already been formed. In October 1920, at the Third Komsomol Congress, Lenin still only dreamed. You can become a communist only when you enrich your memory with the knowledge of all the riches that humanity has produced. 33 years have passed, and Verzilin's book from the school library series visibly and convincingly proved. Lenin's words from the program turned into a fact of everyday practice. New people, free from poverty of spirit, have grown up. People who had so enriched their minds with the knowledge of the spiritual and scientific riches of humanity that they were already able to write new books for those who could become even smarter, freer and more inquisitive than them. Just a book about the history of cultivated plants and useful wild plants. but on its pages the heroes of Jules Verne and Defoe, Mark Twain and Cooper, Mine Reid and Arseniev naturally coexist. Poems by Longfellow about the Indian high water and poems by Makarov, Ivan Surikov, Vsevolod Rozdestvensky, Pyotr Komarov about Russian nature. Quotes from Sadi and Michael Ho-Maclay, stories about the wars of the Scarlet and White Roses and the adventures of the Soviet pilot Marina Raskova. The history of tea, coffee, paints, paper, and tips on how to make this paper, these paints while hiking in the Russian forest, how to build a fire, bake cakes and find the right path into the thicket. The Prisoner of Schlisselburg, the Narodnovolia member Novrossky, the naturalists Burbank and Michurin, the brave captains Declue and Cartier, academicians Peter Pallas, Timuryazev and Abrachev, the legionnaires of ancient Rome and the mummies of Egypt, Sadko and Vaskabuslev. Hundreds of names, dates, situations, and all this does not fall apart but lives a single life of one in creativity, search and work of humanity. A modest book, and at the same time, a majestic result of the Stalin era. One of its logical results, facing forward into the intelligent existence of man, the friend and master of the planet. However, in the early 1930s this was still far away. Actually, at that time the very possibility of such a future in the USSR was still under big question. It is also questionable because real work in the country has only just begun, and because there were many who wanted to criticize it and tear it down. In September 1930, Stalin wrote to Molotov, "Vyacheslav, quiet, for God's sake." The press with its mouth squealing about continuous breakthroughs, endless failures, breakdowns, etc. Nonsense. This is a hysterical Trotskyist right-wing tone, not justified by the data and not suitable for the Bolsheviks. Economic life, Pravda, for industrialization, and partly Izvestia are behaving especially shrilly. Well, for now. Shake your hand. I, Stalin. Yes, you won't envy it. On the one hand, there are former princes who consider you a sadist behind your back. On the other hand, yesterday's comrades, party comrades, who call him an adventurer and are not very loyal to their general secretary. The attitude of the then party ideologists towards Stalin was again involuntarily described by Sergei Golitsyn. Summer of the late 1920s. He crams political literacy using the thick textbook of Berdnikov and Svetlov and the thin textbook of Bukharin's ABC of Communism and Zinoviev's Brief History of the Russian Communist Party, Bolsheviks. Not a single word about Stalin. But in the thick textbook, as Golitsyn testifies, the impossibility of building socialism in one country was proven. 5 years have passed, and the sadist who failed in the eyes of the Golitsyn princess writes to the same Molotov, "Hello, Vyacheslav. 1. Got a letter. We are thinking of organizing cadet schools for artillery, aviation and the navy. 2. I am sending a directive from the Council of People's Commissars and the Central Committee on the compilation of control figures for the 36th year. If the cost of capital work is reduced by 8% and this is a mandatory directive, capital work will be increased to 27 billion with the government issuing 25 billion. This creates an incentive to reduce costs. Increase in school construction, 760 million, light industry, forestry, food industry and local industry, total plus 900 odd million, defense, 1 billion 100 million, healthcare, Moskanalstroy and other items, more than 400 million rubles determined the physiognomy and size of the control figures for the 36th year. I have no regrets, since everything that increases the production of consumer goods must be strengthened from year to year. Without this, there is no way to move forward now. Well, hello, I, Stalin. Is there a need for comments on this picture of the era and on the personality so closely associated with it? On October 1, 1935, the rationing system for meat and fish products, sugar, fats and potatoes was abolished, and from January 1, 1936, for industrial goods, In December 1931, when Stalin talked with the German writer Emil Ludwig, there were cards, but not as a principle, but as a necessity. As for principles, Stalin told Ludwig, equalization has nothing to do with Marxist socialism. Only people unfamiliar with Marxism can imagine the matter so primitively, as if the Russian Bolsheviks want to collect all the benefits together and then divide them equally. A socialism in which all people would receive the same pay, the same amount of meat and bread, and wear the same suits. Marxism does not know such socialism. It is absolutely clear that different people have and will have different needs under socialism. Socialism has never denied differences in tastes, quantity and quality of needs. On December 5, 1936, the VE Extraordinary Congress of Soviets adopted a new Stalinist constitution. There was no article about the referendum, but this once again proved that not everything depended on Stalin. Even a year before the VE Congress of Soviets, he himself believed that a referendum should be introduced. This opinion is unusual for tyrants. At the end of 1936, Prishvin was received in a cozy Moscow literary apartment. The owner, a mediocre folklorist, recently returned from Prague and was impressed by Capic's latest articles. Imagine, Mikhail Mikhailovich, how deep this is. N closed his eyes, paused and recited, in the current state of the world, there are only three paths for the intelligentsia. Complicity in crime, the path of cowardly capitulation or the path of martyrdom. Fatty N fell silent but did not open his eyes and squinted sweetly. He probably imagined himself as a martyr. He shuddered his shoulders, wrinkled his face, and then, apparently afraid that he would suffer too much, quickly opened his eyes, reached for the table, quickly drank a glass of vodka and ate a mushroom. Prishvin sat thinking all this time, and then reluctantly said, the mistake of the Bolsheviks was that they took upon themselves more than a person can generally take upon themselves. To eradicate evil by reasonable means. They gathered, so no one shuddered, and in finishing his salty snack, waved his head and hands in confirmation. Excuse me, comrades, there is another way out. The unsophisticated Novikov Pryboy was always a little shy in this society, but sometimes he showed his voice. Of course, for the former simple battalionman on the Tsushima battleship Eagle, the company was flattering, clean and educated. But you can't go overboard. We didn't collect the mushrooms and tea ourselves, we didn't smoke the white wine ourselves, and we probably didn't catch the salmon ourselves either. Which way, dear Alexei Silich? The owner responded relaxedly. With the people, the battalion answered firmly. Ah, well, yes, of course. We all left the people. Why are you laughing? Terrible times may come. It smells like war. Either the English woman will mess things up again, or it's Hitler. A German is a serious thing. But here, as I see it, there is a lot of carelessness and laziness, and not enough to do. No matter how they ruin Russia for us. Prishvin touched his beard, adjusted his glasses and objected with conviction. What do we care about? Let them ruin the whole country, the word will remain. And we will build the whole country again from the word. Reader, I'll reveal my little trick. I did not invent the folklorist and the famous battle writer, although I did invent some of their lines. But the reciprocal opinions I cited from the singer of Russian nature are not fiction. Just as the conversation between the three writers is not fiction. However, it took place not in 1936 but later. There is an entry about him in Prishvin's diary dated April 4, not rational, but real 1942, when the thoughts expressed by Prishvin looked not only irresponsible and blasphemous but simply treacherous. Why did I have to resort to fiction in a novel research, the basis of which is fact, but then, to invite the reader to think? If Prishvin could think and feel like this even in the terrible year of 1942, then could he and the intellectuals close to him by nature be so inclined in the mid-30s? I think he could and was determined, because very many old intellectuals, especially from literary, artistic, and other circles, not so much helped the Stalin era as observed it from the sidelines. And many of them, being Russian by nationality, became more and more alien to the Russian essence of that Russia, which became more and more dear to its people. By the way, 3 months later, on June 22, 1942, on the anniversary of the start of the real Great Patriotic War, Prishvin found nothing else in his soul other than to write. The rain was continuous day and night, the ground was flooded. It would be very good for gardens, but it's cold, cucumbers don't grow. Mushrooms appeared a few days ago. Russian, Soviet people languished from the heat in the burning doom. Sevastopol dreamed of a sip of water in the trenches of the Don steppes and died, and this builder of Russia worried about cucumbers for the table with the help of words. And what's offensive is that he really was a master of the chaste and purest Russian language. He described nature subtly. Stalin and Molotov in the mid-30s could also have had something like this literary conversation. Here they are, before my eyes, walking along a green alley, and Stalin, quietly smoking his pipe, reflects. You won't get clarity from intellectuals. I just can't understand. Either their heads are a mess, or they're out of spite for the stupid Bolsheviks out of their own heads and into people's. Listen. Everything's mixed up and there's no one to tell that. Gradually getting colder, everything is mixed up, and it's sweet to repeat. Russia, letter, Lorelei. Lead, I understand, but what is Lorelei? Molotov responded, yes, why can't we understand with lead, as they say, sank into oblivion. And Lorelei, there is such a symbol of a destructive, indifferent beauty, sits on the banks of the Rhine, inviting fishermen to the rocks. Heine has a verse. Who wrote this? Mandelstam. Here he also writes, I am in the heart of the century, the path is unclear, and time removes the goal. Molotov suddenly laughed and jokingly suggested, Koba. So he's talking about Trotsky. Maybe about Trotsky. Stalin was serious. There is no last name. It's all here with surnames. And on earth that will escape decay, Stalin will awaken reason and life. Is this him too? He. Molotov was not distinguished by sensitivity. His biography was unsuitable for its development, but he knew how to think, and the subtext of Mandelstam's seemingly muddy poems gradually began to be discerned. He paused and suddenly asked, so, Lorelei sits on the banks of the Rhine and invites you to the rocks. She's calling, damn her. And then you look, and it's sitting on the banks of lead, and he also calls. Yeah, Stalin fiddled with the extinguished receiver and nodded his head again. And who is he inviting? Stalin took a long drag and blew out smoke. For some reason he pulled down his overcoat and, without answering, recited, Russia, letter, Lorelei. Molotov's glasses sparkled. What can I say? If Lorelei means she's inviting whom? And if on the banks of the Rhine she calls for destruction, then what can we say about the banks of lead, the river of oblivion and death? Lorelei, summer, Russia. Deceived by the Bolsheviks, Russia has sunk into oblivion. Yes, Mandelstam's art series turned out to be interesting. But Stalin had already turned the conversation around. Vyacheslav, do you remember the case of Kokorin and Trotsky? Is this from the France Academy? The 30th year? Yes. Then they were still pointing at Tukhachevsky, that he was allegedly preparing the ground for a coup and was even ready to go for a military dictatorship in order to get rid of the Central Committee, collective and state farms and the Bolshevik pace of industrial development. Yes, then at first you assumed that all this came from Kondratyev, Groman and Bukharin. Right-wing minds needed a bayonet in reserve. But I remember well, Koba, that you wrote to me at the end of October. Now, I remember exactly. As for the Tukhachevsky case, the latter turned out to be 100% clean. This is very good. You have a good memory, Molotstein. Yes, I remember it myself. 100%. We read our literature poorly, Vyacheslav, otherwise we would know that only an insurance policy provides a 100% guarantee. So, maybe we can co-opt Ostap Bender into the Politburo, huh? Yes, 100%. By the mid-30s one could only be confident in those who never shied away. And even then this was not a 100% guarantee against anti-state actions. And all the vacillations of various oppositions in the first half of the 20s in the first half of the 30s looked like youthful pranks. Things were already getting more serious and steeper. In September 1932, Molotov was in Ksp. We were returning from another mine. The car was walking along a steep embankment. Suddenly she turned off the road, rolled downhill, overturned and stopped on the edge of a ravine. The security officers were already running from the escort car to the scene of the accident, but Molotov himself tried to get out of the cabin, and the pale driver stood nearby and cried. Valentin Arnold, a member of the local Trotskyist organization, at the last moment lost his nerves and began to slow down. He didn't feel sorry for Molotov, but he felt sorry for himself. In Moscow, Trotskyist militants monitored the movements of Klim Roshalov, but the car of the first Red officer always went so fast that the attempt had to be called off. In May 1934, the terrorist Bogdan was already assessing the shooting range in the conference hall, where Stalin was sitting at the presidium table. It was a bit far from Stalin. In addition, the Trotskyist Bogdan's nerves turned out to be no stronger than those of the Trotskyist Arnold. He did not dare to shoot, but the next day he was shot in his own apartment by Bakayev, the former chairman of the Cheka in Leningrad and one of Trotsky's close ones. In civilian life, Bakayev was once almost shot by order of Lev Davidovich, and now he himself was shooting those who hesitated in choosing between Stalin and Trotsky. There were plenty of hesitant people back then. But if for Trotsky any such chooser was a potential ally, then for Stalin he was a potential traitor, a person dangerous not for Stalin, but for Stalin's cause. Trotsky was counting on defectors. Stalin could not rely on them under any circumstances. Tukhachevsky also decided who to choose, Trotsky or Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky owed his fast career first to Trotsky's entourage and then to Trotsky personally, then chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council of the Republic. During the Polish War, it was Tukhachevsky who rushed to Warsaw in full accordance with the concepts of his political boss. However, these were things of the past. In 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the USSR, and already in 1930, his book Mein Leben, My Life, was published in Berlin in German. If we consider that the book Mein Kampf was popular in Germany at that time, certain associations arise. But in general, the point is not in these associations. It is unlikely that Trotsky liked Hitler as a potential ally in the fight against Stalin. Rather, here Trotsky simply used a commercially profitable title. What was interesting about this book, in particular, was this. Trotsky made false accusations against Lenin, against Stalin, that goes without saying, accusing Lenin of wanting to unrestrainedly attack the Poles. As always, Trotsky would not have been Trotsky if he had not defended himself here. But he touched on the Polish topic sparingly, as well as the entire civil war. Lev Davidovich clearly did not want to show which of the Red commanders he was loyal to and which he was not. He only praised Ephraim Skliansky, who by that time had drowned during a business trip to the USA. Trotsky also remained silent about Tukhachevsky. The calculation here was, of course, with a long-range view. It is believed that the conflict between Stalin and Tukhachevsky arose precisely since the Polish campaign. Maybe so, but until now, few people understand that it was Stalin who then supported the correct, realistic direction of attack towards Lvov. Lviv is Ukraine. It is a legitimate part of the western edge of the Russian land. This is the support of the population. But Tukhachevsky walked through purely Polish lands and already saw himself as Trotsky's warrior in the vastness of revolutionary Europe. It was Trotsky, because Lenin at the end of August 1920 signed the following Politburo resolution. The Politburo decides to express the most severe condemnation of the act of Comrade Tukhachevsky and Smilga, who issued, without any right to do so, their worse than tactless order, undermining the policy of the party and government. We are talking here about the order of the Revolutionary Military Council of the Western Front No. 1847 of August 20, which stated that the Polish peace delegation consists entirely of spies and counterintelligence officers and that peace can only be concluded on the ruins of White Poland. This order contains all of Tukhachevsky, Trotskyist ambitions and arrogance, a penchant for an independent political role, ignoring directives, self-will. This is what grouped a number of his long-time military colleagues around the bright personality of the former commander, and their selection was quite definite. The nobleman Mikhail Tukhachevsky commands the 8th Army during the Civil War. Jonah Yakir is a member of its Rovin Soviet. 1920s. Yakir is the best friend of Gambnik, who became the political leader of the Red Army. This circle includes the most active Trotskyists Milga, Tukhachevsky's right hand on the Polish Western Front, and the most active Trotskyists from the military, Corps Commander Vitaly Primakov and Vitovt Patna. And here are Feldman, Ubarovich, Garkovy, Yakir's deputies Blyakar, Dubovy, Kashirin and dozens of other brilliant army commanders, corps commanders and division commanders who consider themselves such. Trotsky is also supported by two former heads of the political directorate of the Red Army, Antonov Ovsenko and Bubnov, an old friend of the open traitor Barman, who is about to leave our Athens embassy for the bread of the American intelligence services, is the head of the Air Force Alksnis. At the end of the 1920s, Yakir went to study at the German General Staff Academy. After its completion, the old Marshal Hindenburg, president of Weimar Germany, hands him Schlieffen's main military work, cans with the inscription to Mr. Yakir, one of the talented military leaders of our time. Among those who are in close contact with the RHVoice are Kork, Ubarovich, Fishman. Tukhachevsky is a personal friend of von Seeckt himself and knows many RHVoice generals, and they know him. Knows Tukhachevsky and Trotsky, and Tukhachevsky knows Trotsky. He needs a new revolutionary fire, but these are new campaigns under the leadership of Tukhachevsky's subordinates, who have matured in consuming the fruits of the glory of the Civil War and who have stagnated in the stables of command and staff exercises. Yakir Ubarovich Blecker, and now the former lieutenant colonel of the First World War, and now Marshal Igorov, and the former lieutenant, and now Marshal Tukhachevsky, are talking confidentially about the fact that the Secretary General supposedly does not understand military affairs. Let us also take into account this figure. In the 20s and the first half of the 30s, 5,000 former oppositionists were dismissed from the army. This reader read Trotskyists. In the party apparatus, in Soviet institutions, in industry there were even more Trotskyists in the mid-30s. A Trotskyist at that time was automatically, first of all, an opponent of the political course and only secondarily a participant in state and industrial work. And for this reason Trotskyism is increasingly becoming a means of sabotage and direct sabotage. So, in the 30s, on the one hand, the ambition of the Red Napoleons was evident, on the other, the revolutionary spirit of the Red Internationalists with a small-town past, plus they are just career adventurers. The mixture is highly explosive, and this is not a chimera of the NKVD, but reality. Just like reality, such are Trotsky's public statements abroad. The military's dissatisfaction with Stalin's dictates puts their possible action on the agenda. And Trotsky openly calls on the communists in the USSR for a coup d'etat. In these recent years, the self-confident Tukhachevsky has not even really hidden his double-dealing. On March 31, 1935, he wrote in Pravda, "The ruling circles of Germany are directing the main arrow of their operations against the USSR. This is an official thesis for internal use, so that, God forbid, the Soviet Union does not begin to establish normal and even more so friendly relations with Hitler's Reich under General Secretary Stalin and not under General Secretary Trotsky or the dictator Tukhachevsky." This is exactly the line that coincides with the policy of the active Trotskyist Deputy People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Krestinsky and People's Commissar Litvinov himself. A year passes. In April 1936, Imperial England buries King George V. Tukhachevsky is the Soviet military representative at this funeral. On his way to London, he stopped in Berlin, where his old acquaintances from the Reichswehr, which had just been renamed the Wehrmacht, gave him a cordial welcome. The Marshal returns through Paris. Reception at the Soviet embassy, champagne and still unweathered hops from the royal wake. Tukhachevsky loses self-control and blurts out, "We must focus on the new Germany. I am sure that Hitler means salvation for us all." Romanian Foreign Minister Titulescu and French journalist Genevieve Tabouy, sitting nearby, are puzzled. But a certain Pierre Farwak would simply be stunned if he heard this. And that's why, in France, Tukhachevsky had a number of acquaintances made under more than unusual circumstances in German captivity while imprisoned in the Ingolstadt fortress prison. The Germans put their particularly obstinate allied, actually Russian and French officers who made several attempts to escape from captivity. In Ingolstadt, four-time runner, second lieutenant of the Semenovsky Guards Regiment Mikhail Tukhachevsky more than once talked with the future General Gus de Mazarak, with the future not just a general, but the President of France Charles de Gaulle, then a captain, but he especially became friends with Remy Roure. They argued about politics and art, about music and Christianity, and about all this, and above all, about his interlocutor himself, who became the Red Marshal Remir, under the pseudonym Pierre Verweyck, wrote a book that was published in 1928. 8 years later, the author and his hero were sitting in a Parisian cafe, and a Russian dressed in civilian clothes was telling the Frenchman, if you believe the latter, very interesting things. Former comrades, if not in arms then in captivity, have not forgotten about the current moment. According to the Russian emigrant press, we consider you a Germanophile, dear Michel Verweyck noted. Let's clarify, dear Remy, the interlocutor objected. Would I be here, would I go to London, if I didn't think that the Soviet-French pact, which your chamber, I hope, will ratify, is the best political combination for us? That is, Russia must come to an agreement with Western democracies. How was it before the Great War? Yes, the conversation was face to face, and only Remy and Michel themselves knew whether everything told by Verweyck was true. But what's interesting? Tukhachevsky could well have said something like that, and at the same time he could be sincere both in a conversation at the Soviet embassy and in a conversation at a table in a Parisian cafe. During that Great War, Lieutenant Tukhachevsky did not even have time to command a company before he was captured. In a new war, he had a chance to command the entire Russian army, and at a minimum, to play senior command roles in such a war, and he could establish his dictatorship through a direct military coup, both in the event of military successes of the USSR and in the case of failures. In the first case, the glory of the Red Napoleon would work for him, and in the second, the shame of failures that could be attributed to Stalin. As not only Tukhachevsky imagined, a new Great War could take place in alliance with the Western democracies against Germany. Litvinov was leading to this. This is exactly what happened with the First World War, and the Tukhachevskys and Litvinovs didn't give a damn about the fact that both in that war and now for Russia to fight the Germans was stupid and criminal in relation to Russian state interests. But an alliance with Germany could also line up. Why not? This is exactly what Russia needed. So the combinations could be different, even the opposite. And how they could actually turn out, Tukhachevsky, perhaps, did not really care. Not only in strategy, but also in politics and in his personal life, he clearly professed the Napoleonic principle. You need to get involved in battle in time, and then we'll see. Called, or rather self-proclaimed, contenders for supreme power in a huge country, there were three among certain oppositionists. Tukhachevsky was secretly not averse to playing the role of either a military dictator or Trotsky's saber. Trotsky never hid his leader claims. Zinoviev, out of habit, was ready to play second fiddle, but if Trotsky had somehow disappeared from the political horizon, then Zinoviev would not have refused the first role. Although this leader was almost not quoted by the military, Trotsky and Tukhachevsky remained. Here's a revealing detail. Tukhachevsky's biographer Boris Sokolov, who is jaundiced in relation to the history of his own motherland, cites an intelligence report from the Emigrant Wrangel Intelligence Service dated February 15, 1922, which states, the only environment in Russia that could take an active role in the overthrow of Soviet power is the command staff Red Army, that is, former Russian officers. Tukhachevsky is a man of outstanding abilities and with great administrative and military talents. Conscious of his strength and authority, he imagines himself to be a Russian Napoleon. Sokolov comments on this report with amusing profound thought as follows. The leaders of Wrangel's army, it would seem, should have asked the question, Why didn't those serving in the Reds use the much more favorable time of the Civil War for a coup when they sometimes thought that the power of the Bolsheviks was hanging by a thread? However, here it is clearly forgotten that the mass of former lieutenants and staff captains, lieutenant colonels and generals made full use of the time of the Civil War for active attempts to overthrow Soviet power, but not in the ranks of the Red Army, but in the ranks of the White Army. And in the ranks of the Reds there were many future defectors to the Whites, and they tried to organize coups. Suffice it to recall the mutiny of the commander-in-chief of the Eastern Front, former Lieutenant Colonel Muravyev, in July 1918. That's why they trusted the former ones with caution. That's why they were controlled, and in those harsh conditions a successful conspiracy was unrealistic. It's a different matter when you are vested with supreme power. You can calmly and openly invite frontline comrades even to a hunt, even to a party, even to a game of chess. Soviet power won, but did not become so strong that everything was finally decided in its favor. There are many dissatisfied people, splits are emerging within the party. Does the political opposition need bayonets? Well, let's stick with bayonets. Napoleon also began as a bayonet of the Directory, and I, Tukhachevsky, are called Napoleons both on the right and on the left. These thoughts were clearly wandering in the coolly sculpted head of the former guardsman, and he stretched his neck even higher, already stretched either from the desire to see his distant prospects or from Graves' disease that had stuck to the marshal. Accordingly, the long-term interest of emigration in Tukhachevsky and his associates was completely justified in the sense that there really was a smell of fried from this environment. The only mistake the white emigrants made was that they counted on the Tukhachevskys as their own weapon. This is where the pipes come in. Even if the Red Marshals came out against Stalin, it would be under the Red slogans, not in the name of the restoration of the operetta sovereign Vladimir Kryovich or another rich, but in the name of their own unlimited power. Trotsky was a threat only as a politician. Tukhachevsky as a military leader. One was worth the other, and the Trotsky or Tukhachevsky dilemma really existed. Any option meant the death of the country, but was at least one of them real? The country has already become such that it would not allow itself to be destroyed. In the hour of crisis, she would have followed Stalin, and therefore the Trotskyist Tukhachev plans were an adventure doomed to failure in advance. With the exception, however, of one scenario, the physical elimination of Stalin at the very beginning. This is where the collapse of the USSR would be almost inevitable. Later, a legend also arose about the Kirov alternative to Stalin, but only naive people who poorly understood the very fundamentals of the mechanism of the emergence and existence of the highest political leader could think so. A lover of beautiful women, Kirov was the same typical figure of the second row as Rajhanikids, Dzerzhinsky, Franz Rykov, Kubyshev, Bukharin, Kamenev, Rajutek, Pyatakov, Tomsky. Of course, Kirov, like Molotov, like Lazar Kaganovich, would not have been a state, I emphasize state, not a revolutionary leader weaker than any of the Trotsky cohort, including Lev Davidovich. But the large political scale of Kirov, Molotov and Kaganovich, their quality as political leaders of the working masses was completely reflected in the fact that they did not imagine themselves in the leading roles instead of Stalin. This was not servility, but a clear understanding of one's capabilities. Kirov was eliminated in December 1934 because he was Stalin's support in the previously Zinoviyevist, Red Trotskyist Leningrad and did not consider himself capable of bearing with honor not for himself but for the country the burden of the top leadership. But Trotsky, Zinoviev, Tukhachevsky only considered themselves capable of leadership in the new Russia. Many are called, but few are chosen. And if there are few called, then how many are chosen? There was only one like this in Russia at that time. At one time, Dan said about Lenin that it is impossible to resist a man who 24 hours a day thinks about one thing, about the socialist revolution. The same characteristic is fully applicable to Stalin, with the only difference that he thought 24 hours a day about socialist construction in a country that had already accomplished this socialist revolution. The famous socialist revolutionary Viktor Chernov in March 1924 published an article about Lenin in the emigrant magazine Valia Rossi, from which three conclusions could be drawn. about the limitations of Chernow himself, about the pattern of the political collapse of his party, and about the lack of alternative to Lenin as the only possible politician for Russia capable of saving Russia at that turbulent time and not destroying it. Now Stalin turned out to be such a non-alternative politician, the only one capable not of destroying Russia, but of strengthening and exalting it. Chernow wrote about Lenin, whom he knew well. However, what he wrote completely applied to Stalin, whom he did not know. The happy integrity of his nature and a strong instinct for life made him a kind of spiritual vanquished. After all the failures, blows of fate, defeats, he knew how to straighten himself spiritually. His strong-willed temperament was like a steel spring, which gives back the more strongly it is pressed. He was a strong political fighter, just the kind needed to create and maintain an upsurge of spirit and to prevent the onset of panic in the event of failure, encouraging by the power of personal example and instilling unlimited faith in oneself, and to pull back in moments of success when it's so easy and so dangerous to turn into an arrogant party capable of resting on its laurels and overlooking future dangers. He was never a brilliant fireworks of words and images. What distinguished Trotsky, Zinoviev, Bukharin, S.K. He could be clumsy and rude, and he often repeated himself. But these repetitions, both runness and simplicity, had their own system and their own strength. Through the chewing, a living, restless, strong-willed element was breaking through, firmly moving towards the intended goal. He was readily considered ambitious and power-hungry. But he was only naturally, organically powerful. He could not help but impose his will, because he himself was charged with a double charge of it, and because for him it was as natural to subjugate others as it was natural for the central luminary to attract into its orbit and force smaller planets to revolve around themselves, and how it is natural for them to shine not with their own light, but with reflected light. A plebeian by habit and nature, he remained simple and natural in his life after the October triumph, just as before it. Chernow, however, was mistaken in defining Lenin as a plebeian, although here he just wanted to say that Lenin had no sophistication. No, she was. Neither Lenin nor Stalin were simple people. It is precisely the innate aristocracy, as the highest form of naturalness in the complete absence of pose, that comes through in every photograph of Lenin. Stalin. Air Marshal Golovanov once recalled one unusual dinner with Stalin. Churchill, a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, sat at the table of the shoemaker's son. The Englishman began by pouring Armenian cognac into a large glass standing in front of Stalin. Stalin answered him in kind, and the toasts followed one after another, writes Golovanov. Stalin and Churchill drank equally. I heard that Churchill was capable of drinking large quantities of strong drinks, but Stalin was not known to have such abilities. Will something happen? Churchill was getting drunk before our eyes, but nothing changed in Stalin's behavior. Apparently, due to my youth, I showed too open an interest in the state of two political figures and was very worried about how it would all end. The meeting came to an end. Everyone stood up. Churchill left the room, supported by his arms, and I stood, spellbound, and looked at Stalin. Of course, he saw that I was watching him all the time. He came up to me and said, "Don't be afraid, I won't drink Russia away. But Churchill will rush around tomorrow when they tell him what he's been saying." And with a firm, unhurried gait he left the room. Churchill was a patrician by habit, but a plebeian by nature, a servant of the golden minority. Stalin was simple in habits, but possessed that greatness that is given only to a noble soul serving a noble cause. And Trotsky, Bukharin, Kubishev, Rykov, Litvinov, Vale, Vroshelov, Churchill, Roosevelt, Zhukov, and dozens of other political figures, contemporaries of Stalin. They all had weaknesses, petty addictions, passions. If not every, then every second paragraph of Bukharin's articles stuck out. "Oh, how smart and witty I am." Trotsky had a different refrain. "Oh, what a boss I am." Churchill, "How far-sighted and impeccable I am." Roosevelt's cliched smile was supposed to convince him what kind of the guy he was. Stalin's behavior, Stalin's speeches, Stalin's texts said, "Here are we. These are our tasks, and this is how we need to solve them." Tukhachevsky made violins. Touching. Maybe. Churchill laid out brick walls. Stalin, a practical social reformer with unique capabilities, had only one hobby, one passion, the strengthening of Russia, at the head of which he stood. Stalin did not tolerate crows, but at his dacha there were many tame squirrels. Let us think, reader. Could he choose his best friends from among our smaller brothers? Dogs and even cats require a part of their soul for themselves, but a politician who lives for the working people simply does not have the right to spend his spiritual strength on anything other than the people themselves. Horses. This is either the right of a born horseman or the whim of an aristocrat, but a cute Russian little animal that instantly sweeps away trash and fatigue from your soul with its red luxurious tail. What an accurate and humane choice. The squirrel on Stalin's hand. Trust itself is in the hands of those who could appreciate it precisely because they knew very well the price of the right to trust. In the same way, sometimes at the level of instinct, the masses trusted Stalin. Both party and peoples. Trotsky gravitated towards the party elite and the elite in general. Stalin came from the people and gained his party authority. However, let Semyon Vereshchuk, a former socialist revolutionary and an immigrant in the 20s, tell about this better. In Kerensky's Paris newspaper days, in the issues of January 22 and 24, 1928, he published 2 feuilletons about Stalin. What could his political enemy seem to write about Stalin? Here's what. I was still very young when in 1908 the Baku Gendarmerie Department put me in the Baku Bell prison. The prison, designed for 400 people, then contained more than 1,500 prisoners. One day a newcomer appeared in the Bolshevik cell, and when I asked who this comrade was, they mysteriously told me, "This is Kobe." Stalin was 30 years old at the time. SK. Living in shared cells, you inevitably get used to people and customs. The prison environment leaves its mark on people, especially young people, who take examples from their elders. The Baku prison had a huge influence on newcomers. It was a rare young worker who, upon leaving this prison, did not become a professional revolutionary. It was a propaganda and combat revolutionary school. Among the leaders of meetings and circles, Kobe also stood out as a Marxist, in a blue shirt with an open collar, always with a book.